Mr. Cruel, Australia's shadow predator. Between 1987 and 1991, the suburbs of Melbourne, Australia, lived in terror as a masked figure stalked the night, targeting young girls in their own homes. The perpetrator, who became known as Mr. Cruel, would conduct a series of horrific home invasions that shocked the nation and launched one of Australia's most extensive criminal investigations. Mr. Cruel's first confirmed attack occurred on August 22, 1987, in Lower Plenty. A 13-year-old girl was awakened in her bedroom by a masked intruder who had cut the power to her family's home. The attacker bound her father, subjected the family to a terrifying ordeal, and then meticulously bathed the young victim before releasing her the following morning. The calculated nature of the attack and the perpetrator's apparent obsession with cleanliness immediately set this case apart from typical home invasions. What made these crimes particularly disturbing was the methodical approach the perpetrator used. He would spend considerable time surveilling potential victims and their families, learning their routines, and identifying the optimal moments to strike. He always wore a mask and used voice-changing equipment to disguise his identity, demonstrating a level of preparation that suggested extensive planning and possibly professional knowledge of criminal investigation techniques. On December 27, 1988, Mr. Cruel struck again, this time in Ringwood. 10-year-old Sharon Wills was abducted from her home after the intruder tied up her parents and brother. For 18 agonizing hours, the family had no idea what had happened to their daughter. Sharon was eventually found by police on Christmas Day, chained to a concrete pillar in a remote location, weak but alive. The discovery brought both relief and horror to the community, as it became clear that a sophisticated predator was operating in their midst. The pattern continued on July 3, 1990, when 13-year-old Nicola Linus was taken from her Canterbury home. After 50 hours of captivity, she was released, but the psychological trauma was evident. She returned, wearing a neck brace, complaining of stiffness that suggested she had been restrained for extended periods. Each attack followed the same disturbing template: careful surveillance, methodical execution, and the perpetrator's obsessive attention to eliminating forensic evidence. The investigation into these crimes, dubbed Operation Spectrum, became one of Australia's largest law enforcement efforts. The Victorian Police assembled a task force of approximately 300 detectives who worked tirelessly to identify the perpetrator. By 2016, they had checked over 30,000 homes, interviewed 27,000 people, and followed up on more than 10,000 tips from the public. Despite this massive investigative effort, Mr. Cruel seemed to stay one step ahead of law enforcement. He left virtually no forensic evidence at any crime scene, suggesting either extensive knowledge of police procedures or possibly a background in law enforcement or military service. His ability to enter homes without triggering alarms, disable power systems, and navigate complex suburban layouts indicated someone with specialized skills. The case took a tragic turn on February 13, 1991, when Mr. Cruel abducted 13-year-old Carmaine Chan from her Templestowe home. Unlike his previous victims, Carmaine would never return alive. After forcing her two younger sisters into a wardrobe, the masked intruder took Carmaine at knife point and vanished into the night. For more than a year, Carmaine's fate remained unknown. Then, in approximately 18 months later, her body was discovered at Edgar's Creek in Thomastown. The autopsy revealed she had been shot 3 times in the head and chest, marking a dramatic escalation in the perpetrator's violence. Police immediately linked her elimination to the earlier attacks, recognizing the same methodical approach, but with a deadly conclusion. The loss of Carmaine Chan galvanized both law enforcement and the community. Investigators theorized that unlike the previous victims, Carmaine had been feisty and potentially posed a greater risk of identifying her attacker. This resistance may have cost her life, as Mr. Cruel apparently decided she was too dangerous to release alive. The investigation revealed several disturbing aspects of the perpetrator's behavior. He would often spend hours in victims' homes, meticulously searching through personal belongings and seeming to derive satisfaction from the psychological terror he was inflicting. He would change vehicles during kidnappings, suggesting access to multiple cars or an organized support network. Most chilling of all, he sometimes drew floor plans of victims' houses, indicating extensive pre-attack surveillance. Survivors described how Mr. Cruel would speak in a calm, controlled manner throughout his attacks, never showing signs of panic or losing control of the situation. He would tell families to avoid involving police, making veiled threats about the consequences of continued law enforcement involvement. This psychological manipulation was as much a part of his method as the physical crimes themselves. The perpetrator's bathing of victims became one of his most distinctive and disturbing characteristics. Survivors reported that he would wash them like a mother washing a baby, paying obsessive attention to eliminating any potential forensic evidence. This behavior suggested someone with detailed knowledge of how criminal investigations worked and a determination to avoid leaving any traces that could lead to his identification. Over the years, numerous suspects were investigated and eliminated. Tips poured in from across Australia and even internationally, as the case captured public attention and spawned countless theories about the perpetrator's identity. Some investigators theorized that Mr. Cruel might have been connected to utility companies, given his knowledge of power systems. Others suggested military or law enforcement backgrounds based on his tactical approach to the crimes. In 2010, police announced they had identified new suspects, though details were not made public to protect the ongoing investigation. Former detective Colin McLaren speculated that the perpetrator might be deceased or have left Australia, which could explain why the attack stopped so abruptly after Carmaine's demise in 1991. The psychological impact on the Melbourne community was profound and lasting. Parents who had previously felt safe allowing their children to play outside suddenly found themselves installing elaborate security systems and maintaining constant vigilance. The knowledge that such a calculating predator could operate undetected for years shattered assumptions about suburban safety. In 2016, authorities increased the reward for information leading to Mr. Cruel's identification to $1 million Australian dollars, one of the largest rewards ever offered in Australian criminal history. The announcement was accompanied by renewed public appeals and the release of additional details about the case that had previously been held back to protect the investigation. Carmaine's mother, Neri Chan, became a prominent advocate for victims' rights and continued to keep her daughter's case in the public eye through media appearances and community events. Her tireless efforts helped ensure that Mr. Cruel's crimes would not be forgotten and that pressure would remain on authorities to solve the case. The investigation incorporated advances in forensic science as they became available, including DNA analysis and improved fingerprint techniques. However, the perpetrator's meticulous approach to evidence elimination meant that investigators had limited physical evidence to work with, making identification extremely challenging even with modern technology. As of 2023, the case remains officially open and active, Authorities continue to follow up on tips and investigate potential suspects, though the passage of time has made the investigation increasingly difficult. Many of the original investigators have retired, and witnesses' memories have faded, creating additional challenges for current detectives working the case. The Mr. Cruel case serves as a chilling reminder of how a single individual with the right combination of intelligence, planning ability, and complete lack of empathy can terrorize an entire community for years. It also demonstrates the limitations of even the most extensive law enforcement efforts when confronting a perpetrator who understands how to avoid detection. Whether Mr. Cruel is still alive or has long since passed away may never be known. However, his crimes left an indelible mark on Australian society and continue to influence how law enforcement approaches cases involving child predators. The investigation remains one of the most comprehensive in Australian criminal history, a testament to the determination of investigators and the community to find justice for his victims. Anita Cobby, Sydney's darkest night. On February 2nd, 1986, 26-year-old Anita Cobby finished her shift as a nurse at Sydney Hospital and met friends for dinner in Blacktown. The former beauty queen had recently separated from her husband and was living with her parents while working to rebuild her life. What should have been a routine evening would instead become the catalyst for one of Australia's most notorious criminal cases. After dinner with friends, Anita planned to call her father from a payphone to arrange a ride home. When she discovered the phone was out of order, she decided to walk the short distance to her parents' house along Newton Road. It was a decision that would cost her life and shock the Australian public with its senseless brutality. As Anita walked along the dark road around 9:45 p.m., a stolen Holden Kingswood carrying 5 occupants pulled alongside her. The men inside had been drinking heavily and looking for trouble when they spotted the solitary figure walking alone. Without hesitation, 2 of them jumped from the vehicle and forced Anita into the car, beginning an ordeal that would last several hours and end in unimaginable tragedy. The 5 perpetrators were a collection of society's failures: John Travers, 19 years old and unemployed; Michael Murdoch, 18, and 3 members of the Murphy family: Michael Murphy, 33, Gary Murphy, 28, and Leslie Murphy, 22. All came from backgrounds marked by poverty, dysfunction, and previous brushes with the law. Their paths had converged that night in a stolen car, fueled by alcohol and a toxic combination of resentment and violence. Over the next several hours, Anita was subjected to horrific treatment that would shock even experienced investigators when the details emerged. The perpetrators drove her to remote locations where they took turns committing violent acts against her. When they realized she might be able to identify them, their violence escalated to deadly levels. John Travers, the youngest of the group, ultimately took Anita's life by slashing her throat with such violence that the wound nearly severed her head completely. Her body was then dragged through barbed wire fences and dumped in a cow paddock near Prospect, where it would lie undiscovered for 2 days. The callous disposal of her remains demonstrated the complete dehumanization that had driven their actions. When Anita failed to return home, her worried parents contacted police and organized search parties with friends and neighbors. The discovery of her body on February 4th sent shockwaves through Sydney and beyond. The brutality of the crime, combined with Anita's status as a respected nurse and former beauty queen, created a perfect storm of public outrage. Detective Sergeant Ian Kennedy was assigned to lead the investigation, and his methodical approach would prove crucial to solving the case quickly. Within 3 weeks of the crime, All 5 perpetrators had been identified, arrested, and charged. The speed of the resolution was remarkable, especially given the complexity of coordinating the actions of multiple suspects. The investigation revealed that the perpetrators had made little effort to conceal their involvement in the crime. They had used a stolen vehicle that was easily traced, left physical evidence at multiple crime scenes, and several witnesses had observed suspicious activity during the night in question. Their lack of sophistication as criminals worked in favor of the investigators. When the case went to trial, the evidence against all 5 men was overwhelming. Under laws governing joint criminal enterprise, each defendant was held equally responsible for Anita's demise, regardless of their individual level of participation in specific acts. The prosecution successfully argued that once they had decided to work together in taking Anita's life, all were equally culpable for the final outcome. The public reaction to both the crime and the trial was intense and emotional. Demonstrators gathered outside courthouses demanding the restoration of capital punishment, which had been abolished in New South Wales years earlier. The protesters created effigies and carried signs calling for the ultimate penalty for Anita's attackers. Nurses from Sydney Hospital, where Anita had worked, formed honor guards during court proceedings and organized vigils to remember their murdered colleague. The nursing community was particularly affected by the loss of one of their own, and their visible grief helped humanize the victim for the broader public. The media coverage was extensive and often graphic, with newspapers providing detailed accounts of the evidence presented during the trial. This coverage contributed to the public's emotional investment in the case and helped maintain pressure for severe sentences. The combination of Anita's innocent victim status and the extreme nature of the violence created a narrative that resonated powerfully with the Australian public. In 1987, all 5 perpetrators were convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The sentences were among the harshest ever handed down by Australian courts and reflected both the severity of the crime and the public demand for justice. The judge made it clear that the sentences were intended to reflect community outrage and deter similar crimes. The aftermath of the case had lasting impacts on Australian society and law enforcement. Police departments across the country implemented new protocols for handling cases involving group violence, and specialized units were created to investigate crimes with multiple perpetrators. The case became a textbook example of how quickly public sentiment could shift toward demands for harsher criminal penalties. Anita's family became advocates for victims' rights and worked to ensure that her memory would be honored through positive changes to the criminal justice system. Her mother and stepfather spoke publicly about the need for better support services for crime victims' families and pushed for legislative changes that would give victims a stronger voice in criminal proceedings. The case also highlighted issues of social inequality and the factors that can contribute to violent criminal behavior. The backgrounds of the 5 perpetrators revealed patterns of family dysfunction, substance abuse, and social marginalization that experts argued needed to be addressed to prevent similar crimes in the future. Over the years, several of the perpetrators have died while serving their sentences. Gary Murphy died of cancer in custody in 2019, while the others remain imprisoned nearly 4 decades after their crimes. None have ever expressed genuine remorse for their actions, and their continued incarceration reflects the enduring public belief that their crimes were so heinous as to warrant permanent removal from society. The case has been the subject of numerous books, documentaries, and academic studies examining both the crime itself and its broader social implications. Television specials continue to revisit the case periodically, ensuring that Anita's story remains in public memory and that the lessons learned from the investigation are not forgotten. In 2007, a television dramatization brought renewed attention to the case, though it focused more on the community response and investigative process than on gratuitous depictions of violence. The production was careful to respect the dignity of Anita's memory while educating new generations about the impact of violent crime on families and communities. Brian Waters, Cannabis Farm Horror. On June 19, 2003, 36-year-old father Brian Waters received a phone call that would lead him into one of the most horrific ordeals ever recorded in British criminal history. What began as a routine business dispute over £20,000 would escalate into 4 hours of systematic torture witnessed by his own children, ultimately claiming his life and shocking the nation with its sheer brutality. Brian Waters was an ordinary working-class man from Warrington, Cheshire, who had become involved in low-level cannabis cultivation to supplement his income. While his activities were illegal, nothing in his background suggested he was prepared for the level of violence that would be directed against him by more serious criminals who viewed him as an easy target for intimidation and exploitation. The orchestrator of Brian's torture was 50-year-old John Wilson, a career criminal who had invested money in cannabis operations and believed that Brian owed him a substantial debt. Rather than pursue legal remedies or even typical criminal intimidation tactics, Wilson decided to make an example of Brian that would serve as a warning to others who might consider crossing him in the future. Wilson enlisted the help of Christopher Guestmore, a 43-year-old man who operated under various aliases including Andrew Lamb. Moore had been posing as a documentary filmmaker while actually serving as Wilson's enforcer and debt collector. His ability to blend into legitimate society while harboring violent intentions made him particularly dangerous to unsuspecting victims like Brian. On that fateful June day, Moore and Wilson lured Brian to Burnt House Farm in Tabley under the pretense of resolving their financial dispute through negotiation. They also brought along Brian's wife Julie and his 19-year-old housemate Suleiman Razak, ostensibly as witnesses to their agreement. What followed would test the limits of human cruelty and endurance. Once at the isolated farm location, the atmosphere quickly changed from business meeting to nightmare scenario. Wilson and his associates revealed their true intentions as they overpowered Brian and Suleiman, binding them securely and making it clear that this would not be a simple conversation about money. Julie was allowed to leave at one point, though whether this was planned or a miscalculation by the perpetrators remains unclear. What transpired over the next 4 hours represented a level of systematic torture that shocked even experienced investigators and prosecutors. The perpetrators had clearly planned their actions in advance, bringing tools and equipment specifically designed to inflict maximum pain and suffering. They suspended Brian from the ceiling, beat him with hammers and metal bars, and used industrial staples to puncture his chest and feet. Perhaps most horrifically, they forced both victims' legs into electrified barrels of liquid, combining the agony of chemical burns with electrical shock. The perpetrators recorded portions of their actions on video, laughing and celebrating as they inflicted increasingly severe injuries on their helpless victims. The recordings would later serve as crucial evidence in their prosecution. The torture was not random violence, but appeared to follow a deliberate escalation designed to maximize psychological as well as physical trauma. The perpetrators seemed to derive satisfaction not just from causing pain, but from demonstrating their complete power over their victims. The systematic nature of the abuse suggested that this was not their first experience with extreme violence. Suleiman Razak, though severely injured, managed to survive the ordeal and would later serve as a crucial witness in the prosecution of Brian's attackers. His survival was likely due to a combination of luck and the perpetrator's primary focus on Brian as their main target. The young man's ability to testify about what he had witnessed would prove essential to securing convictions. When emergency services finally arrived at the farm, alerted by a worker who discovered the aftermath, they found a scene that traumatized even veteran first responders. Brian's body bore evidence of the extended torture session, while Suleiman was barely alive, having been left gagged and stapled into a barrel. The crime scene was so brutal that it required specially trained personnel to process the evidence. The initial investigation moved quickly, as the perpetrators had made little effort to conceal their identities or destroy evidence. Wilson and several accomplices, including Otis Matthews and James Raven, were arrested and convicted in 2004, receiving life sentences for their roles in Brian's torture and demise. However, the mastermind, Christopher Guest Moore, had fled to Spain using false identity documents, beginning an 18-year manhunt that would span multiple countries and involve international law enforcement cooperation. His ability to evade capture for nearly 2 decades demonstrated a level of criminal sophistication that made him particularly dangerous. The case highlighted serious problems with how British authorities monitored and tracked individuals involved in organized crime. Moore's ability to operate under multiple identities and move freely between countries exposed weaknesses in international information sharing that potentially allowed other dangerous criminals to avoid justice. During his years as a fugitive, Moore continued to live under assumed names and may have been involved in additional criminal activities in various European countries. His eventual capture in Malta in 2019 was the result of improved international cooperation and advances in identity verification technology that made it increasingly difficult for fugitives to maintain false identities. When Moore was finally brought to trial in 2021, the prosecution was able to present overwhelming evidence of his central role in planning and executing Brian's torture. DNA evidence collected from the original crime scene definitively linked him to the farm, while witness testimony and recorded communications demonstrated his leadership role in the conspiracy. The trial proceedings provided additional horrific details about the extent of Brian's suffering and the calculating cruelty of his attackers. The judge's sentencing remarks emphasized that the crime represented one of the most extreme examples of torture and deliberate infliction of suffering in recent British legal history. For Brian's family, the conviction of Moore brought some measure of closure after nearly 2 decades of uncertainty and pain. However, the trauma of losing their loved one in such horrific circumstances, combined with the long delay in achieving complete justice, had taken a severe psychological toll on those who survived him. The case had broader implications for British law enforcement's approach to organized crime and drug-related violence. The extreme brutality demonstrated by Wilson and his associates showed that the stakes in illegal drug operations had escalated far beyond what many participants realized when they became involved in what seemed like relatively minor criminal activities. The Waters case became a cautionary tale about the dangers of becoming involved with serious criminals, even in seemingly minor capacities. Brian's initial involvement in cannabis cultivation was relatively small-scale, but it brought him into contact with individuals who operated by entirely different rules and were willing to use extreme violence to enforce their will. Today, Brian Waters is remembered not just as a victim of horrific violence, but as a reminder of how quickly involvement in illegal activities can escalate beyond anyone's control or expectations. His case continues to be studied by law enforcement agencies as an example of the extreme violence that can emerge from seemingly routine criminal disputes. Hey everyone, it's here with a quick reminder to like and subscribe if you appreciate this content. Also, remember to check out my other channels for more unsolved mysteries and true crime stories. Lacey Fletcher. On January 3, 2022, emergency responders in Slaughter, Louisiana, arrived at what they expected would be a routine medical call. Instead, they discovered a scene so horrific that it would haunt experienced first responders and shock the nation with its incomprehensible cruelty. 36-year-old Lacey Fletcher had been found dead on her family's living room couch, but the circumstances of her death would reveal a story of neglect so extreme that it challenged basic assumptions about human dignity and family responsibility. When paramedics entered the Fletcher home, they were confronted with conditions that seemed impossible in modern America. Lacey's emaciated body had literally become fused with the couch cushions through years of immobility and neglect. Her weight had dropped to just 96 pounds, giving her a body mass index of approximately 15, well below the threshold for severe malnutrition. The scene was made even more disturbing by evidence of long-term abandonment and decay. Lacey's body was covered with insect larvae, and the couch itself was discolored from years of decomposition and waste. Her hair was infested with parasites, and her limbs showed signs of severe muscle atrophy from lack of movement. The kitchen nearby was filled with dirty dishes and unopened mail, suggesting that normal household activities had ceased years earlier. Lacey Fletcher had been born in 1985 as a healthy child, but was diagnosed with autism and developmental delays during her early years. As she entered adulthood, family members reported that she began experiencing more severe cognitive decline, possibly due to a progressive neurological condition that was never properly diagnosed or treated by medical professionals. Rather than seeking appropriate medical care or institutional support for their daughter's declining condition, Lacey's adoptive mother, Sheila Fletcher, and stepfather, Clay Fletcher, made a decision that would ultimately cost Lacey her life. They withdrew her from all outside contact and educational services, essentially imprisoning her within their home without access to proper medical care or social interaction. The extent of the neglect was almost impossible to comprehend. According to investigators, Lacey had been confined to the same couch for at least 12 years, with only a towel placed underneath her to absorb waste. She was never bathed, never moved to prevent bed sores, and rarely fed adequate amounts of food to maintain basic health. Her parents continued their normal activities around her, watching television, doing household chores, and even taking vacations while leaving her alone to suffer. Medical examiners determined that Lacey had died from systemic infection and organ failure, resulting from years of immobilization and poor hygiene. The chronic exposure to waste products had caused severe skin breakdown and allowed bacteria to enter her bloodstream, ultimately overwhelming her immune system. Her death had been both slow and agonizing, occurring over a period of weeks or months as her body gradually shut down. The physical evidence found at the scene painted a picture of suffering that was difficult for investigators to process emotionally. Lacey's waste had accumulated to such an extent that insect larvae had begun consuming her living tissue, creating wounds that never had the opportunity to heal. The couch itself had become a breeding ground for parasites and bacteria that further compromised her already fragile health. What made the case even more disturbing was the apparent normalcy with which Lacey's parents had continued their lives, while their daughter slowly died just feet away from them. Neighbors reported that the Fletcher home rarely received visitors, and family members who might have intervened were either unaware of Lacey's condition or had been deliberately kept away by her parents. When Sheila Fletcher, 66, and Clay Fletcher, 70, were initially arrested, they were charged with second-degree elimination, reflecting the prosecutor's belief that their neglect had been so extreme as to constitute deliberate indifference to human life. The charges carried the possibility of life imprisonment if the defendants had been convicted on the most serious counts. However, during plea negotiations in February 2024, both defendants agreed to plead no contest to the lesser charge of negligent homicide. This plea allowed them to avoid trial while acknowledging legal responsibility for Lacey's death, without admitting moral culpability for their actions. The judge who accepted their pleas sentenced each defendant to 20 years in prison without the possibility of early release, emphasizing that while the charges had been reduced, the court still viewed their actions as representing extreme criminal neglect that resulted in their daughter's death. The case prompted widespread outrage and calls for reform in how authorities monitor and protect vulnerable adults who may be at risk of abuse or neglect. Child welfare advocates pointed out that Lacey's situation should have been detected and addressed long before it reached such a critical stage. But systematic failures had allowed her suffering to continue unnoticed for more than a decade. The Fletcher case also highlighted significant gaps in social services and medical monitoring for adults with disabilities. Unlike children who are required to attend school and receive regular medical checkups, disabled adults can sometimes fall through the cracks of the social safety net if their families choose to isolate them from outside contact. Mental health professionals who reviewed the case expressed shock at the level of neglect that had been allowed to continue for so many years. They noted that even families struggling with caregiving responsibilities for disabled relatives typically seek some form of outside assistance rather than allowing conditions to deteriorate to such an extreme degree. The community of Slaughter, Louisiana, was deeply shaken by the revelation that such horrific abuse had been occurring in their midst without detection. Local law enforcement agencies began reviewing their procedures for conducting welfare checks and responding to reports of possible neglect or abuse of vulnerable adults. Social media reaction to the case was intense, with many people expressing disbelief that such conditions could exist in contemporary America. The case became a rallying point for disability rights advocates who argued that society has a collective responsibility to protect vulnerable individuals from neglect and abuse. The Lacey Fletcher case serves as a stark reminder that some of the most vulnerable members of society can suffer in silence while those responsible for their care fail in the most basic human obligations. Her death represents not just a failure of individual responsibility, but a systematic failure of the institutions that should protect those who cannot protect themselves. Lacey's story continues to influence discussions about disability rights, elder abuse prevention, and the responsibility of family members to provide appropriate care for dependent relatives. While her parents faced decades in prison for their actions, the broader questions raised by her death about how society protects its most vulnerable members remain largely unanswered. Charlene Downs. On November 1st, 2003, 14-year-old Charlene Downs left her family home in Blackpool, Lancashire, for what should have been an ordinary evening in the town centre. Instead, she vanished without a trace, becoming the center of one of Britain's most controversial missing person cases and exposing a web of exploitation that would shock the nation. Charlene had moved to Blackpool with her family in 1999, drawn like many others by the promise of seaside opportunities and a fresh start. However, the family soon discovered that beneath Blackpool's tourist-friendly facade lay a darker reality where vulnerable young people, particularly teenage girls from troubled backgrounds, could easily become targets for predatory individuals. By 2003, Charlene had unfortunately become involved with a network of older men who frequented the town center area. These individuals operated what was essentially a grooming operation, offering food, cigarettes, and small amounts of money to teenage girls in exchange for various forms of exploitation. The practice was more widespread than authorities initially realized, with dozens of local girls potentially affected. On the night she disappeared, Charlene was last seen around 6:45 p.m. near several fast food establishments in Blackpool's town center. Witnesses reported seeing her in the vicinity of various takeaway shops where she was known to spend time, but no one could provide definitive information about exactly when or how she had disappeared from the area. When Charlene failed to return home, her family immediately contacted Lancashire police and began their own desperate search for answers. Unlike many missing person cases involving teenagers, there was no suggestion that Charlene had run away voluntarily or that she had been planning to leave home. Her disappearance was completely out of character and suggested that something serious had happened to her. The initial police investigation quickly revealed the disturbing scope of exploitation affecting young girls in the Blackpool area. As detectives dug deeper into Charlene's activities and associates, they uncovered evidence of systematic grooming involving numerous adult men and potentially dozens of underage victims. The scale of the problem was far larger than anyone had previously suspected. Court proceedings would later reveal that Charlene had been subjected to serious mistreatment by multiple individuals before her disappearance. She was reportedly one of as many as 60 local girls who had been targeted by organized groups of men operating in the takeaway shop area. These predators used a variety of tactics to identify and exploit vulnerable teenagers who lacked adequate family support or supervision. In August 2007, police took the significant step of charging 2 local men in connection with Charlene's disappearance and presumed death. Ifeid al-Batiki, who owned a takeaway restaurant called Funny Boys, was charged with taking her life, while his business associate Mohammed Reveshi was charged with helping to dispose of her body. The charges against these men were based partly on conversations that had been recorded by undercover police officers. In these recordings, al-Batiki allegedly made disturbing jokes about Charlene's fate, including suggestions that her remains had been processed into food served at his establishment. These comments, while horrific, were presented as evidence of his involvement in her disappearance. However, when the case came to trial in September 2007, the prosecution faced significant challenges in presenting their evidence. The recorded conversations, while disturbing, could potentially be interpreted as dark humor rather than confessions of criminal activity. More importantly, police had never recovered Charlene's body or found any physical evidence linking the defendants to her disappearance. The trial proceedings were complicated by the broader context of the exploitation network that had been operating in Blackpool. While there was clear evidence that numerous young girls had been mistreated by various individuals, establishing specific criminal responsibility for Charlene's disappearance proved more difficult than prosecutors had anticipated. After hearing all the evidence, the jury was unable to reach unanimous verdicts against either defendant. One man was acquitted of taking Charlene's life, while the jury failed to reach any verdict regarding the other defendants' alleged role in disposing of her body. The prosecution decided not to pursue a retrial, citing the loss of key evidence and the challenges inherent in the case. The collapse of the trial was devastating for Charlene's family, who had hoped that the legal proceedings would finally provide answers about what had happened to their daughter. The failure to secure convictions also meant that the broader exploitation network continued to operate with relative impunity, putting additional young people at risk. Despite the unsuccessful prosecution, police have continued to investigate Charlene's disappearance using new techniques and following up on additional leads as they emerge. In 2017, another man was arrested on suspicion of taking her life, but he was released after 2 days without being charged, suggesting that the evidence against him was insufficient. The case has been periodically reviewed using advancing forensic technologies, including DNA analysis of preserved evidence from 2003. However, without Charlene's body or clear physical evidence linking specific individuals to her disappearance, investigators face ongoing challenges in building a prosecutable case. A significant reward of £100,000 remains available for information leading to the arrest and conviction of those responsible for Charlene's disappearance. The substantial amount reflects both the seriousness with which authorities view the case and their continued hope that someone with crucial information might eventually come forward. The broader implications of Charlene's case extend far beyond her individual disappearance. The investigation exposed systematic failures in how authorities had addressed the exploitation of vulnerable young people in Blackpool and similar communities across Britain. The case became a catalyst for improved training and procedures for identifying and responding to organized grooming operations. In 2023, a documentary titled Charlene Downs, Still Missing, brought renewed attention to the case. By interviewing family members, investigators, and experts in child exploitation, the program examined both the specific circumstances of Charlene's disappearance and the broader social problems that had allowed such widespread mistreatment of young people to continue undetected. Child protection advocates have used Charlene's case to highlight the need for better support services for vulnerable teenagers and more aggressive prosecution of those who exploit young people. They argue that the failure to achieve justice for Charlene represents a broader systematic problem in how society responds to the exploitation of marginalized youth. Today, nearly 20 years after Charlene Downs vanished from those Blackpool streets, her case remains officially open and under investigation. While the likelihood of finding her alive has virtually disappeared, her family continues to hope for answers about what happened and for justice against those responsible for her disappearance. Amy Lynn Bradley, lost at sea on March 24, 1998. The Bradley family awoke aboard the Royal Caribbean cruise ship Rhapsody of the Seas to discover that 23-year-old Amy Lynn Bradley had vanished without a trace during the night. What should have been a relaxing Caribbean vacation would instead become the beginning of one of the most perplexing maritime disappearances in modern history, launching decades of investigation and spawning theories that range from tragic accident to international human trafficking. Amy had been traveling with her parents, Ron and Iva Bradley, and her brother Brad on what was intended to be a peaceful family getaway. The Bradley family from Petersburg, Virginia, had booked the 7-day cruise as a way to spend quality time together and escape the stresses of daily life. Amy, a trained lifeguard and strong swimmer, was particularly excited about the Caribbean destinations and water activities. The 23-year-old was described by those who knew her as outgoing, intelligent, and responsible. She had recently graduated from Longwood University with a degree in physical education and was working as a computer technician while considering her future career options. Amy was known for her athletic abilities and had been a competitive swimmer during her school years. The cruise had begun on March 19, 1998, and had been proceeding without incident as the ship made stops at various Caribbean ports. The family had enjoyed exploring different islands, participating in shore excursions, and taking advantage of the ship's amenities. Amy had been particularly social during the cruise, making friends with other passengers and crew members. On the evening of March 23rd, the ship's final night at sea, before returning to port, Amy had spent time with her family at dinner and then joined them in one of the ship's lounges. The previous evening had been spent enjoying the ship's entertainment, with Amy dancing in the disco until the early morning hours, alongside other passengers and some crew members. Amy had returned to the family's cabin around 3:40 a.m. on March 24th, as confirmed by electronic keycard records that tracked when passengers entered their rooms. The family was sharing a cabin with a balcony on one of the upper decks, and Amy had expressed how much she enjoyed the ocean views and fresh air from their private outdoor space. Ron Bradley later recalled seeing his daughter sleeping on a deck chair on their cabin's balcony around 5:30 in the morning when he briefly stepped outside. This would be the last confirmed sighting of Amy by anyone who knew her personally. The image of his daughter peacefully sleeping in the early morning light would haunt Ron for years to come. When Ron returned to check on Amy around 6 a.m., she had completely disappeared, leaving behind her personal belongings and no explanation for where she might have gone. Her purse, identification, and other valuable items were still in the cabin, suggesting that she had not planned to leave permanently or had not had time to gather her possessions. The timing of Amy's disappearance was particularly puzzling, because it occurred during the brief window between her father's two sightings, when most of the ship's passengers and crew were asleep. The deck areas were largely deserted at that hour, making it unlikely that her departure was witnessed by casual observers who might later provide information to investigators. Ship security immediately initiated a comprehensive search of the vessel, checking every accessible area from the engine rooms to the upper decks. The massive cruise ship had numerous decks, restaurants, lounges, and service areas that needed to be systematically searched. When this effort failed to locate Amy, the ship's captain notified the United States and Dutch Antilles Coast Guard, as the vessel was traveling in international waters near the island of Curaçao. The Coast Guard response was immediate and extensive, involving multiple ships and aircraft in a search pattern that covered approximately 65,000 square miles of Caribbean waters. For 4 days, rescue teams scoured the ocean looking for any sign that Amy might have fallen overboard and survived in the water, or washed up on a nearby shore. The search included both surface vessels and aircraft, equipped with specialized equipment for spotting objects or people in the water. Coast Guard helicopters flew grid patterns over the search area, while ships used sonar and other detection equipment to look for any trace of Amy beneath the surface. Commercial vessels in the area were also alerted to watch for any signs of a missing person. Despite the massive search effort, no trace of Amy was found in the ocean. No personal belongings, no evidence of someone having gone overboard, and no sightings by other vessels in the area. The complete absence of any physical evidence in the water led investigators to consider the possibility that Amy might not have fallen from the ship at all. The initial assumption that Amy had accidentally fallen overboard was challenged by several factors. She was known to be a strong swimmer who was comfortable around water, making it less likely that she would have drowned even if she had ended up in the ocean. Additionally, the ship's railings were designed to prevent accidental falls, and there were no obvious circumstances that would have caused her to go overboard. As the investigation continued, more troubling possibilities began to emerge. Some witnesses reported seeing Amy in the company of crew members during the evening before her disappearance, raising questions about whether someone on the ship might have been involved in her vanishing. These reports suggested that Amy had been socializing with staff members who had access to areas of the ship not available to regular passengers. One particularly disturbing lead involved reports of a woman matching Amy's description being seen in various Caribbean locations after the cruise had ended. These alleged sightings, if accurate, would suggest that Amy had been taken from the ship against her will and was being held somewhere in the region. The first reported sighting came from a former U.S. Navy petty officer named David Carmichael, who claimed he had seen a woman matching Amy's description on a beach in Curacao shortly after the cruise ship had docked. According to Carmichael, the woman appeared distressed and was accompanied by two men who seemed to be controlling her movements. Over the years, numerous unverified sightings have been reported from locations throughout the Caribbean and beyond. Witnesses have claimed to see a woman matching Amy's description in nightclubs, on beaches, and in various other settings. However, none of these reports have been conclusively verified, and many have been dismissed as cases of mistaken identity. The most controversial aspect of Amy's case involves allegations that she may have become a victim of human trafficking. Some investigators have suggested that she could have been targeted by criminals operating in the cruise ship industry, who specialize in abducting passengers for exploitation purposes. This theory gained credibility from the knowledge that the Caribbean region has significant problems with human trafficking, and that cruise ships can provide opportunities for criminals to identify and target potential victims. The international nature of cruise ship travel also creates jurisdictional complications that can make investigation and prosecution more difficult. The trafficking theory was supported by reports from other passengers who claimed to have seen Amy with crew members who were not supposed to be socializing with guests. Some witnesses reported seeing her in areas of the ship that were typically restricted to staff, raising questions about whether she had been lured into a trap by someone with inside knowledge of the vessel. However, law enforcement agencies have been cautious about endorsing the trafficking theory without concrete evidence. The FBI has investigated numerous tips and leads related to Amy's case, but has never been able to confirm that she survived her disappearance or identify specific individuals responsible for her vanishing. The cruise line's response to Amy's disappearance has also been a source of controversy. Critics have argued that Royal Caribbean was slow to alert authorities and may have been more concerned about protecting their reputation than finding Amy. The company has maintained that they followed proper procedures and cooperated fully with law enforcement. The Bradley family has never given up hope of finding Amy or learning what happened to her. They have hired private investigators, offered substantial rewards for information, and maintained a high public profile for the case through media appearances and a dedicated website. Their determination has kept Amy's case in the public eye for more than 2 decades. Ron and Iva Bradley have traveled throughout the Caribbean, following up on reported sightings and working with local law enforcement agencies to investigate potential leads. They have spent their life savings on private investigators and have endured countless false hopes and disappointments in their quest to find their daughter. In 2025, Netflix released a documentary series titled Amy is Missing that presented new interviews and analysis of the case. The series examined previously undisclosed details and raised additional questions about the initial investigation and the cruise line's response to Amy's disappearance. The case has also led to improvements in cruise ship safety protocols and passenger monitoring systems. Royal Caribbean and other cruise lines have implemented enhanced security measures designed to prevent passengers from going overboard undetected and to improve response times when someone does go missing. Modern cruise ships now have more sophisticated surveillance systems, improved lighting on deck areas, and better procedures for conducting searches when passengers are reported missing. However, critics argue that these improvements came too late to help Amy and other passengers who may have faced similar fates. The case has also influenced legislation related to crime reporting on cruise ships. The Cruise Vessel Security and Safety Act, passed by Congress in 2010, requires cruise lines to report crimes to the FBI and maintain better records of incidents that occur during voyages. Despite nearly 3 decades of investigation and public attention, Amy Lynn Bradley's fate remains unknown. The FBI continues to maintain an open case file and offers a reward of $25,000 for information leading to her location or the identification of those responsible for her disappearance. The case serves as a reminder of how quickly someone can vanish, even in seemingly secure environments like cruise ships. It also highlights the challenges faced by law enforcement when investigating crimes that occur in international waters and involve potential victims who may have been transported across multiple jurisdictions. The Bradley family's advocacy has also brought attention to the broader issue of missing persons cases and the challenges faced by families seeking answers. Their persistence in pursuing every lead and maintaining public awareness of Amy's case has inspired other families facing similar situations. Today, Amy Lynn Bradley would be in her early 50s if she is still alive. Joyce Vincent, the Invisible Woman. In January 2006, housing officials in Wood Green, North London, entered a small bedsit apartment to change the locks due to unpaid rent. What they discovered inside would shock Britain and become a symbol of urban isolation and societal indifference. 38-year-old Joyce Carol Vincent had been dead for over 2 years, her body so decomposed that only skeletal remains were left slumped on her sofa, surrounded by the remnants of a life that had ended without anyone noticing. The scene that greeted the housing workers was both mundane and horrifying in its ordinariness. The television was still tuned to BBC One, its constant chatter providing a soundtrack to an empty room for months on end. Christmas presents from 2003 remained unwrapped under a small artificial tree, their bright wrapping paper now faded and dusty. Stacks of unopened mail had accumulated by the door, creating a paper monument to Joyce's increasing isolation from the world. Bills, advertisements, government communications, and personal correspondence had piled up undisturbed, telling the story of a woman who had gradually disappeared from all official records and personal connections. The refrigerator contained expired food that had long since decomposed, while dishes sat unwashed in the sink, covered in a thick layer of dust that told the story of years without human presence. The flat had become a time capsule, preserving the final moments of Joyce's life, while the world outside continued without her. Joyce's body had decomposed so completely that she could only be identified through dental records, a process that took additional time and highlighted just how thoroughly she had vanished from everyone's awareness. The medical examiner estimated that she had died sometime in December 2003, meaning she had remained undiscovered in her flat for approximately 2 years and 1 month. During that entire time, spanning multiple seasons, holidays, and years, no one had noticed her absence from the world. No friends had called wondering why she wasn't returning their messages. No colleagues had inquired about her extended absence, and no family members had grown concerned about the lack of contact. The case immediately raised disturbing questions about how someone could disappear so completely from society without anyone noticing or caring enough to investigate. Joyce had been born in Grenada and had immigrated to Britain as a child with her family, part of the Caribbean diaspora that sought better opportunities in the former colonial motherland. During the 1980s and early 1990s, Joyce had worked as a secretary in London's financial district, the heart of British commerce, where she earned a steady income and seemed to be living a relatively normal urban life. Colleagues from that period described her as friendly and competent, someone who appeared to have successfully integrated into British professional society. However, by the early 2000s, Joyce had become increasingly isolated from her family and friends. Those who had known her during better times reported that she had gradually cut off contact with most people in her life, apparently due to a combination of personal pride and possibly an abusive relationship that had made her reluctant to reach out for help. The transformation from connected professional to isolated recluse appears to have happened gradually over several years, making it difficult for anyone to pinpoint exactly when Joyce began withdrawing from social contact. Former friends and colleagues reported that she had simply stopped responding to invitations and phone calls without explanation. Joyce had briefly lived in a domestic violence shelter before moving to the Wood Green flat, suggesting that she may have been fleeing a dangerous situation. The trauma of that experience, combined with health problems including asthma and peptic ulcers, may have contributed to her decision to withdraw from social contact rather than risk further harm. The investigation into Joyce's death found no evidence of foul play or forced entry into her apartment. The door had remained locked from the inside, and there were no signs of violence or struggle anywhere in the flat. The coroner was unable to determine an exact cause of death due to the advanced state of decomposition, but the most likely explanations were complications from her asthma or ulcer condition. The absence of any obvious external cause of death suggested that Joyce had simply died alone from natural causes, possibly during an asthma attack or medical emergency that no one was present to witness or respond to. The tragedy was not how she died, but how she had lived in her final years, completely cut off from human contact and support. What made Joyce's case particularly heartbreaking was the evidence of how completely she had been forgotten by the world around her. Her mail had been piling up for years without anyone questioning why she wasn't collecting it or responding to important communications. Utility bills had gone unpaid, leading to services being cut off. Yet even this hadn't prompted welfare checks. She had apparently been evicted in absentia, without anyone questioning why she hadn't responded to legal notices or appeared in court to contest the proceedings. The bureaucratic machinery of modern life had continued to generate paperwork and legal actions around Joyce's life, even as she sat decomposing in her chair. None of her neighbors recalled seeing Joyce or noticed that she had disappeared, despite living in close proximity to her for years. The flat was located above a shopping center in a busy urban area, yet somehow her absence went completely undetected, despite the fact that decomposition would have created noticeable odors and other signs of disturbance. The case became a media sensation when it was covered by major newspapers and television programs throughout Britain and internationally. The story struck a nerve with readers who recognized elements of urban isolation in their own lives and feared that they too could disappear without anyone noticing. Joyce's story sparked widespread soul-searching about social isolation and community responsibility in modern Britain. Politicians and social activists questioned how such a situation could occur in a supposedly civilized society, and what systems might be put in place to prevent similar tragedies in the future. The case also highlighted serious problems with how social services and housing agencies monitor vulnerable individuals. Joyce had clearly been struggling with various personal problems, including domestic violence and health issues, but had fallen through the cracks of support systems that might have provided assistance or at least maintained contact with her. Member of Parliament Lynn Featherstone used Joyce's case to call for better oversight of isolated individuals, particularly those with known health problems or histories of domestic violence. She argued that government agencies had a responsibility to ensure that vulnerable people didn't simply disappear from official view without anyone noticing or caring. The documentary film Dreams of a Life was produced in 2011 by Carol Morley, bringing Joyce's story to an even wider audience and prompting additional discussions about urban anonymity and social responsibility. The film attempted to reconstruct Joyce's life and understand how she had become so isolated from human contact. Morley's research revealed that Joyce had once been vibrant and social, with friends and colleagues who remembered her fondly from earlier periods in her life. The film explored how someone who had once been well-connected could gradually withdraw from all social relationships until she became completely invisible. Joyce's case also influenced popular culture beyond the documentary, with musician Alex Turner of Arctic Monkeys citing her story as inspiration for songwriting. Her experience became a powerful metaphor for the loneliness and disconnection that can exist even in densely populated urban environments, where millions of people live within miles of each other. Law enforcement and housing agencies have since used Joyce's case as an example of the importance of conducting proper welfare checks when tenants become unresponsive to official communications. New protocols have been implemented in many areas to ensure that unexplained absences are investigated more thoroughly before legal proceedings are initiated. Social work courses now include Joyce Vincent's story as a cautionary tale about the importance of maintaining contact with vulnerable clients and recognizing signs that someone may be withdrawing from social contact in dangerous ways. Her case has become a teaching tool for understanding how multiple system failures can combine to create tragic outcomes. The flat where Joyce died was quickly cleared and re-rented after her remains were removed, with new tenants moving in who were likely unaware of what had happened there. No memorial exists to mark the location or remember her life, though her story continues to be told through various media as a reminder of how easily people can become invisible in modern society. Today, nearly 20 years after Joyce Vincent's death was discovered, her case remains a powerful symbol of urban isolation and the importance of maintaining human connections. While the exact circumstances of her death may never be fully understood, the broader questions raised by her disappearance from society continue to influence discussions about community responsibility and social support systems. Joyce's story serves as a reminder that behind every missing person case or unexplained death is a real human being who deserved to be noticed, remembered, and mourned. Her tragedy was not just that she died alone, but that she lived alone in a world full of people who might have helped if they had only known she needed them. Asha Degree, The Valentine's Day Mystery. In the early morning hours of February 14, 2000, 9-year-old Asha Jakila Degree made a decision that would baffle investigators and haunt her family for more than 2 decades. The young girl left her home in Shelby, North Carolina, during a heavy rainstorm and vanished into the darkness, launching one of America's most perplexing missing child cases. Asha was a responsible, well-behaved child who had never shown any inclination to run away or disobey her parents. She lived with her father Harold, mother Aquila, and older brother O'Brien, in a close-knit family where the children were carefully supervised and loved. The Degree family had moved to their modest home on Oakcrest Street, in a quiet residential neighborhood where children played safely and neighbors looked out for one another. Harold worked at a local manufacturing plant, while Aquila was employed at a daycare center, both parents maintaining steady jobs that provided stability for their family. They were active members of their church community and emphasized education and good behavior in raising their children. Asha was known as a bright student who enjoyed reading and was particularly fond of her school basketball team. On the night of February 13th, Asha had attended a basketball game at her school, where she was a student at Falston Elementary. The game had been disappointing for her team, as they suffered a defeat, but Asha returned home in good spirits nonetheless. She completed her homework assignments, spent time with her family, and went to bed at her normal time around 9 p.m. Her parents made their usual rounds, checking on both children around midnight, finding them sleeping peacefully in their shared bedroom. The house was secure, the weather outside was deteriorating, with increasing rain and wind, and there was no indication that anything unusual was about to occur. At approximately 2:30 a.m., O'Brien later reported that he heard his sister's bed creak, but he assumed she was simply shifting in her sleep and thought nothing of it at the time. This may have been the moment when Asha made the fateful decision to leave her home, though her motivations remain completely unknown, even after decades of investigation. When Harold Degree awoke at 6 a.m. to prepare for his early morning shift, he discovered that Asha was missing from her bed. A frantic search of the house revealed that she had taken some clothing items, including a white shirt and jeans, but had left behind her jacket and most of her personal belongings. Most puzzling of all, she had walked out into one of the worst storms the area had experienced in months, with heavy rain and strong winds that would have made travel extremely dangerous for a small child. The weather conditions on that February morning were truly treacherous. Temperatures had dropped into the 30s, rain was falling steadily, and wind gusts were strong enough to make walking difficult even for adults. For a 9-year-old child to voluntarily venture out in such conditions seemed almost incomprehensible to investigators and family members alike. Within hours of discovering Asha's absence, her parents contacted the Cleveland County Sheriff's Department and organized search parties with neighbors and community volunteers. The immediate response was massive, with hundreds of people scouring the rural area around the Degree home looking for any sign of the missing girl. Churches, schools, and community organizations mobilized to help with the search effort. The first significant breakthrough came when truck drivers traveling on Highway 18 reported seeing a young African-American girl walking alone in the early morning hours. The sightings occurred approximately 1 mile from Asha's home, and the descriptions matched her perfectly. Multiple independent witnesses reported seeing the same small figure walking along the dangerous highway in the pre-dawn darkness. One truck driver, Jeff Rupi, was so concerned about the child he saw that he turned his vehicle around and went back to offer help. However, when he approached, the small figure ran into the woods and disappeared from view. This behavior suggested that whoever the child was She was avoiding contact with adults and was determined to continue her journey despite the obvious dangers. The fact that multiple independent witnesses had observed Asha walking voluntarily along the highway raised profound questions about her motivations. She was clearly not being forced to travel at gunpoint or under obvious duress, but her decision to venture out in dangerous weather conditions during the middle of the night made no logical sense to anyone who knew her. Investigators immediately began exploring various theories about what could have motivated Asha to leave her home. Had she been lured out by someone she trusted? Was she trying to meet someone she had arranged to see? Had something frightened her enough to make her flee her own house? Each possibility seemed to present its own set of problems and contradictions. The search effort expanded to include trained search dogs, helicopters, and specialized rescue teams, experienced in finding missing children. Every abandoned building, wooded area, and potential hiding place within miles of the Degree home was systematically searched. Despite these extensive efforts, no additional trace of Asha was found in the immediate area. For more than a year, the investigation proceeded with few concrete leads, despite extensive efforts by local, state, and federal authorities. The FBI joined the case early, recognizing that the circumstances suggested possible abduction by someone who had lured Asha away from her home. Behavioral analysts studied the case and concluded that it was extremely unusual for a child of Asha's age and temperament to leave home voluntarily under such conditions. The investigation included extensive interviews with everyone who had contact with Asha in the days leading up to her disappearance. Teachers, classmates, family friends, and neighbors were all questioned about any unusual interactions or conversations they might have had with her. Despite these efforts, no one could provide information that explained why she might have left home. In March 2001, more than a year after Asha's disappearance, construction workers made a disturbing discovery along Highway 18. Wrapped in plastic bags and buried in a remote area approximately 30 miles from the Degree home, they found Asha's backpack containing some of her personal belongings. The location was far from where she had last been seen, suggesting that someone had transported her belongings there deliberately. The discovery of the backpack represented both a breakthrough and a frustration for investigators. While it confirmed that Asha had not simply wandered away and gotten lost, it also suggested that she had likely met with foul play. The careful packaging and burial of her belongings indicated deliberate concealment by someone who understood the importance of hiding evidence. Forensic analysis of the backpack and its contents provided additional clues but also raised new questions. The items inside were consistent with what a 9-year-old girl might pack for a short trip, but they didn't explain why she had decided to leave home in the first place. The condition of the items suggested they had been buried relatively soon after Asha's disappearance. The case remained relatively dormant for nearly 2 decades, with periodic reviews and follow-up investigations failing to generate new leads. However, advances in DNA technology and genetic genealogy began offering new possibilities for solving cold cases like Asha's. In 2023, the FBI made a stunning announcement that breathed new life into the investigation. Advanced DNA analysis of evidence from Asha's belongings had produced matches to specific individuals. The DNA evidence pointed to 2 siblings, identified as Dedmon Ramirez and his sister, who had been minors at the time of Asha's disappearance. Even more significantly, investigators believed that the siblings' parents, Roy and Connie Dedmon, had been involved in helping to conceal evidence of the crime. This development suggested a coordinated effort by multiple family members to harm Asha and cover up their actions. The involvement of an entire family in such a crime was particularly disturbing and raised questions about how children could be involved in something so horrific. Following the DNA revelations, law enforcement conducted extensive searches of properties connected to the Dedman family and issued nationwide alerts seeking additional information about their activities in 2000. Ground-penetrating radar was used to search potential burial sites, and cadaver dogs were brought in to assist with the investigation. However, despite the apparently strong forensic evidence, no arrests have been made, suggesting that prosecutors are still working to build a comprehensive case that can withstand the scrutiny of a criminal trial. The challenges of prosecuting a case more than 2 decades old, particularly one involving minors who are now adults, are considerable. In June 2025, North Carolina authorities announced an additional $25,000 reward for information leading to arrests in Asha's case. The substantial reward reflects the continued high priority that law enforcement places on solving this case and their belief that someone in the community has information that could lead to successful prosecutions. The case has had a profound impact on the Shelby community, which has rallied around the Degree family throughout their ordeal. Annual memorial walks are held on the anniversary of Asha's disappearance, with hundreds of participants retracing the route she might have taken on that fateful morning. A billboard asking people to bring Asha home served as a constant reminder of the unsolved case for many years until it was finally taken down. Local schools have implemented enhanced safety programs as a direct result of Asha's disappearance, teaching children about the dangers of leaving home alone and the importance of telling trusted adults about any unusual contacts or invitations they might receive. The case has become a touchstone for discussions about child safety in the community. Harold and Iquilla Degree have never given up hope of finding answers about their daughter's fate. They have appeared on numerous television programs, maintained a website dedicated to finding Asha, and worked tirelessly to keep her case in the public eye. Their unwavering determination has been an inspiration to other families facing similar tragedies. The psychological toll on the Degree family has been enormous. O'Brien, who was just 10 years old when his sister disappeared, has spoken publicly about the impact the case has had on his life and his family's dynamics. The uncertainty and constant hope, mixed with fear, have created a unique form of prolonged grief that few people can understand. Child safety advocates have used Asha's case to emphasize the vulnerability of even well-supervised children to predators who may spend considerable time planning their crimes. The fact that someone was apparently able to lure a responsible 9-year-old from her safe home environment highlights the sophistication that some criminals bring to targeting young victims. The mystery of why Asha left her home that stormy February morning may never be fully resolved, even if her killers are eventually brought to justice. The psychological manipulation required to convince a young child to venture out in dangerous conditions suggests a level of planning and predatory skill that is deeply disturbing to contemplate. Today, Asha Degree would be in her mid-30s if she had lived, a fact that serves as a stark reminder of all the life experiences that were stolen from her and her family. While the recent DNA developments have provided new hope for justice, they have also confirmed the worst fears about what happened to Shelby's sweetheart on that dark Valentine's Day morning more than 2 decades ago. Maura Murray, the vanishing student. On February 9, 2004, 21-year-old nursing student Maura Murray left her dormitory at the University of Massachusetts Amherst and drove north into the New Hampshire mountains setting in motion one of America's most analyzed and debated missing person cases. What began as a seemingly routine departure from college would end with Maura's complete disappearance and spawn countless theories about what happened during her final hours. Maura was a high-achieving student who had transferred to UMass Amherst from the prestigious West Point Military Academy. The transition from military life to civilian college had been challenging, but she was described by those who knew her as intelligent, athletic, and generally responsible. She was studying nursing and had ambitions of helping others through a medical career, though she had been experiencing some personal difficulties in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. Born in 1982, Maura grew up in a tight-knit family with her father Fred, mother Lori, and several siblings. The Murray family emphasized achievement and resilience, values that had helped Maura succeed academically and athletically throughout her youth. However, the pressure to excel may have also contributed to some of the stress she was experiencing during her final semester. In the days before she vanished, Maura had been involved in a minor car accident that had left her emotionally shaken and possibly facing insurance or legal complications. The accident had occurred while she was working her campus security job, and she had damaged her father's car, which she was borrowing at the time. This incident seemed to trigger a period of increased anxiety and problematic behavior. She had also been drinking more heavily than usual and had been caught using stolen credit card numbers to order food, incidents that suggested she was under considerable stress and making poor decisions. These behaviors were completely out of character for someone who had previously been responsible and law-abiding, raising concerns among her family and friends. Maura's relationship with her boyfriend Bill Rausch, who was serving in the military, had also been experiencing strain. Long-distance relationships are difficult under the best of circumstances, and the combination of academic pressure, personal problems, and separation from her boyfriend created a perfect storm of emotional distress for the young woman. On the morning of February 9th, Maura sent an email to her professors claiming that she needed to take a week off from classes due to a family emergency. However, when her family was later contacted, they confirmed that no such emergency existed and that they had not asked Maura to come home for any reason. This deception suggested that Maura was planning something that she didn't want others to know about. Maura spent the day gathering her belongings and converting her remaining financial aid money into cash. She packed her car with personal items, school materials, and several bottles of alcohol before leaving campus sometime in the afternoon. She also packed what appeared to be enough clothing for several days, though her exact destination remained a mystery even to those closest to her. Her internet search history from the days before her departure revealed that she had been researching vacation rentals in the White Mountains region of New Hampshire, suggesting that she had planned to spend extended time in the area rather than just passing through. However, no reservations were ever found under her name at any hotels or rental properties in the region. Around 7:30 p.m., Maura's 1996 Saturn sedan crashed on Route 112 in Haverhill, New Hampshire, approximately 150 miles from her college. The car had struck a tree and sustained front-end damage, though the accident appeared to be relatively minor and the vehicle was still operational. The crash occurred on a dark, rural stretch of road with few nearby houses. A local resident named Butch Atwood, who lived nearby, witnessed the accident and approached Maura to offer assistance. He later described her as appearing shaken but not seriously injured. When he offered to call police or provide other help, Maura declined and asked for just a few minutes to assess the situation and gather her belongings. A passing school bus driver also stopped and offered to call for help, But Maura assured him that she had already contacted roadside assistance through AAA and just needed time to handle the situation herself. This claim was later proven to be false, as no such call was ever made to any roadside assistance service. When New Hampshire State Police arrived at the scene approximately 15 minutes after the bus driver's call, they found Maura's car with its hazard lights flashing, but no sign of Maura herself. The keys were missing from the ignition, and some of her personal belongings were gone, suggesting she had left the scene voluntarily rather than being forcibly removed. The circumstances of the crash raised immediate questions about Maura's condition and intentions. The car showed signs of previous damage that was unrelated to the recent accident, damage that had occurred during her campus security job incident days earlier. Investigators also noted that the airbag had deployed during the earlier incident, but had been stuffed back into the steering wheel rather than professionally repaired. Inside the car, police found alcohol containers and what appeared to be evidence that Maura had been drinking while driving. However, there was no indication that alcohol impairment had caused the accident, and the crash pattern was consistent with someone who had simply lost control on an icy mountain road during winter conditions. The most perplexing aspect of the scene was Maura's complete disappearance in such a short time frame. The area where she crashed was rural but not completely isolated, and it seemed impossible that she could have traveled far on foot without being seen by passing motorists or residents of nearby homes. The weather was cold and snowy, making foot travel extremely difficult. Search efforts began immediately and eventually involved hundreds of volunteers, professional search teams, and advanced technology, including helicopters and trained search dogs. The New Hampshire Fish and Game Department, local police, and eventually the FBI all participated in the search for Maura. Despite these extensive efforts, no trace of her was found in the immediate area or in the broader region where she might have traveled on foot. The investigation revealed several puzzling details about Maura's final days and her preparations for the trip. Beyond researching vacation rentals, her internet search history also showed that she had been researching information about dealing with alcohol-related driving problems and had looked up details about disappearing and starting a new life under a different timer identity. These searches raised questions about whether her disappearance might have been voluntary rather than the result of foul play. The combination of her personal problems, the fake family emergency, and her research into disappearing suggested that Maura might have been planning to start over somewhere else. However, Maura's family adamantly rejected the idea that she would voluntarily disappear without contacting them. They pointed out that despite her recent problems, she maintained close relationships with her relatives and had never expressed any desire to completely cut ties with her previous life. Her father, Fred, became particularly vocal in advocating for continued investigation of her disappearance as a potential crime. The case attracted significant media attention, particularly after Maura's family began their own investigation efforts and started a website dedicated to finding answers. The combination of mysterious circumstances, an attractive young victim, and the complete lack of resolution made the case a subject of intense public fascination and internet speculation. Over the years, numerous theories have been proposed to explain Maura's disappearance. Some investigators believe she succumbed to the elements while trying to hike through the mountains, possibly becoming lost or injured in areas that were not thoroughly searched. The harsh winter conditions in New Hampshire could easily have been fatal to someone unprepared for extended outdoor exposure. Others suspect that she was picked up by someone who offered to help but instead harmed her. The rural area where she crashed was not heavily traveled, but it was possible that someone with malicious intent happened to drive by during the brief window when she was alone and vulnerable. More exotic theories have suggested that Maura successfully disappeared on purpose and is living under a new identity somewhere else. Proponents of this theory point to her internet research about changing identities and argue that her preparations for the trip were more elaborate than would be necessary for a simple vacation or temporary escape from her problems. The case has also attracted the attention of numerous amateur investigators and true crime enthusiasts who have conducted their own research and proposed various solutions. Online forums dedicated to Maura's case have generated thousands of posts analyzing every detail of her disappearance and proposing new theories about what might have happened. Some have focused on analyzing cell phone records and credit card transactions, while others have attempted to recreate Maura's final journey and identify potential witnesses who might have seen her after the crash. These amateur efforts have occasionally generated new leads for official investigators to pursue. In 2020, previously unreleased police reports provided new details about the investigation, including information about potential suspects who had been questioned but never charged. However, these revelations raised as many questions as they answered and did not provide definitive proof of what happened to Maura. The New Hampshire State Police continue to classify Maura's disappearance as suspicious and maintain an active investigation, though they acknowledge that the passage of time has made it increasingly difficult to develop new leads. They have consistently stated that they believe someone in the public has information that could help solve the case. Maura's family has never given up hope of finding answers about her fate. Her sister Julie has become a prominent advocate for missing persons and has used various media platforms to keep Maura's case in the public eye. The family continues to organize search efforts and follow up on tips from the public, no matter how much time passes. The case has inspired numerous books, documentaries, and podcast series, each offering different perspectives on what might have happened during Maura's final hours. While none have provided definitive answers, they have helped maintain public interest in the case and generated new tips for investigators to pursue. The enduring mystery of Maura Murray's disappearance has also influenced how law enforcement agencies handle missing person cases involving young adults. Her case demonstrated the importance of taking such disappearances seriously, even when the missing person is legally an adult and may have left voluntarily. Today, 20 years after Maura Murray disappeared on that snowy New Hampshire road, her case remains one of America's most famous unsolved missing person cases. Whether she died that night in the mountains, was the victim of foul play, or somehow managed to start a new life elsewhere, continues to be debated by investigators, family members, and the countless people who have become invested in solving this enduring mystery. Jeanette De Palma, The Devil's Teeth Mystery. On August 7, 1972, 16-year-old Jeanette De Palma left her family home in Springfield, New Jersey, telling her mother she was going to visit friends in the neighborhood. It was a routine summer day that would end in one of the state's most bizarre and disturbing unsolved cases, complete with allegations of occult ritual and decades of controversy about what really happened on a remote clifftop known by the ominous nickname Devil's Teeth. Jeanette was a typical teenager of the early 1970s, attending Jonathan Dayton High School and maintaining friendships with other young people in her working-class neighborhood. She came from a stable Italian-American family that had lived in Springfield for generations, and there was nothing in her background to suggest she was involved in anything dangerous or unusual. The De Palma family lived on Mountain Avenue, in a modest home where Jeanette shared space with her parents and siblings. Her father worked as a laborer while her mother managed the household. representing the kind of traditional working-class family structure that was common in New Jersey at the time. Jeanette was described as a good student, who generally followed rules and stayed out of trouble. The summer of 1972 was a time of significant social upheaval in America, with the counterculture movement, anti-war protests, and changing attitudes about authority, creating tensions in many communities. However, Springfield remained a relatively conservative suburb where most families tried to maintain traditional values and lifestyles. When Jeanette failed to arrive at her intended destination and didn't return home that evening, her worried parents contacted police and began searching for their daughter themselves. The Springfield Police Department initiated a missing person investigation, but in 1972, law enforcement resources and techniques for finding missing people were far more limited than they would become in later decades. Despite their efforts and an organized search by local authorities, no trace of Jeanette could be found in the immediate area. Volunteers from the community joined the search, combing through parks, wooded areas, and abandoned buildings where a teenager might have gone or been taken. The search was hampered by the large amount of undeveloped land in the area and the limited technology available to investigators. For 6 weeks, Jeanette's fate remained a complete mystery. Her family held out hope that she might have run away or been taken somewhere, but would eventually return safely or be found by authorities. However, those hopes were shattered on September 19, 1972, when a local resident walking his dog made a gruesome discovery. The dog had brought its owner a decomposing human arm, leading searchers to a clifftop area at the Hudai Quarry in Union County, several miles from Springfield. The location was known locally by the ominous nickname Devil's Teeth, reflecting both its jagged appearance and its reputation as a place where teenagers sometimes engaged in risky behavior or experimentation with drugs and alcohol. What investigators found at the scene would fuel decades of speculation and controversy about what had happened to Jeanette and whether supernatural or ritualistic forces had been involved in her death. The scene was unlike anything most of the responding officers had encountered in their careers. Jeanette's skeletal remains were arranged within what appeared to be a coffin-shaped pattern of sticks and logs that had been deliberately arranged around her body. Surrounding the remains were small wooden crosses and what some witnesses claimed were animal bones, creating a scene that seemed to suggest ritual or occult activity had taken place. The arrangement was so unusual and deliberate that investigators immediately suspected they were dealing with something far more complex than a typical teenage tragedy. The positioning of the remains and the surrounding objects suggested that someone had spent considerable time creating what appeared to be a ritualistic scene. The medical examiner's investigation was severely hampered by the advanced state of decomposition, making it extremely difficult to determine an exact cause of death or gather physical evidence that might point to specific perpetrators. However, based on the positioning of the remains and other evidence from the scene, the coroner believed that Jeanette had been strangled. The apparent ritual aspects of the crime scene immediately captured media attention and public imagination throughout New Jersey and beyond. During the early 1970s, there was widespread concern about occult activities among young people, fueled by sensationalized media coverage of groups like the Manson family and cultural fears about changing social norms. Local newspapers and television stations covered the story extensively, often emphasizing the more sensational aspects of the crime scene rather than focusing on the systematic investigation. Headlines spoke of devil worship and ritual sacrifice, creating a narrative that may have obscured the actual facts of the case and made it more difficult for investigators to pursue conventional leads. The timing of the discovery also contributed to public fears about occult activity, as it occurred during a period when many Americans were concerned about the influence of drugs, rock music, and alternative spirituality on young people. The satanic panic that would reach its peak in the 1980s was already beginning to influence how people interpreted unusual crimes. However, over the years, some of the more exotic details of the crime scene have been questioned by investigators and journalists who have re-examined the case with fresh eyes and more sophisticated analytical techniques. What initially appeared to be evidence of ritual activity may have been natural formations or staging designed to mislead investigators. In 2024, Weird New Jersey magazine, which had previously promoted occult theories about the case in various articles and books, announced that their review of the available evidence suggested no occult activity was actually involved in Jeanette's death. This revision represented a significant shift in how one of the case's most prominent chroniclers viewed the evidence. The revision of these details has led some investigators to focus on more conventional explanations for Jeanette's death. The most likely scenario may be that she was taken by someone she knew, possibly a classmate or local acquaintance, and that the apparent ritual arrangements were either coincidental natural formations or deliberate staging designed to mislead investigators and create false leads. One theory that has gained attention over the years involves the possible connection to Richard Cottingham, known as the Torso Killer, who was active in the New York and New Jersey area during the early 1970s. Cottingham was later convicted of numerous crimes involving young women, and his methods and timeline made him a potential suspect in Jeanette's case. However, despite some similarities in timing and methodology, no definitive link has ever been established between Cottingham and Jeanette's case. Cottingham himself has never been officially connected to her death, and investigators have been unable to find concrete evidence linking him to the Springfield area during the relevant time period. The investigation has been significantly hampered by the passage of time and the loss of physical evidence and witness testimony. Many of the original investigators have retired or passed away, taking with them institutional knowledge about the case and potential leads that were never fully pursued. Moreover, memories of events from over 50 years ago have inevitably faded or become unreliable, making it difficult to verify accounts or develop new leads based on witness recollections. The physical evidence from the crime scene has also degraded over time, limiting the effectiveness of modern forensic techniques. Despite these challenges, the case has never been officially closed, and periodic reviews have been conducted using new investigative techniques and technologies as they become available. The Springfield Police Department has maintained the case file and continues to follow up on tips and leads as they arise, though the frequency of such developments has decreased significantly over the decades. Amateur investigators and true crime enthusiasts have also maintained interest in Jeanette's case, conducting their own research and proposing various theories about what might have happened. Some have focused on potential suspects from her school or neighborhood, while others have examined the possibility of connections to other unsolved cases from the same time period. The case has taken on legendary status in New Jersey folklore, often cited as an example of the mysterious and unexplained crimes that can capture public imagination for decades. Each year, vigils are held by the organization Justice for Jeanette de Palma, keeping her memory alive and maintaining pressure for the case to be solved. The controversy surrounding the alleged occult aspects of the crime has also made Jeanette's case a subject of academic interest for those studying moral panics and media sensationalism. Researchers have examined how initial reports of ritual elements may have influenced both public perception and the direction of the official investigation. Today, more than 50 years after Jeanette De Palma disappeared on that summer day in Springfield, her case remains one of New Jersey's most famous unsolved crimes. Whether she was the victim of a random predator, someone she knew, or circumstances more exotic than anyone has imagined, continues to be debated by those who remember the case and those who have discovered it through true crime media. The enduring mystery of what happened at the Devil's Teeth serves as a reminder that some crimes resist explanation despite decades of investigation and speculation. On July 4, 1928, Belgian financier Alfred Lowenstein boarded his private Fokker aircraft at Croydon Airport, bound for Brussels with 6 other passengers. At 51 years old, Lowenstein was one of the world's wealthiest men, controlling vast business empires across Europe and beyond. What should have been a routine flight would instead become one of aviation's most enduring mysteries. As the aircraft cruised at 4,000 feet over the English Channel, Lowenstein excused himself to use the lavatory at the rear of the plane. The small aircraft had 2 doors in the back section, one leading to the washroom facilities and another that opened directly to the outside. This exterior door was spring-loaded and designed to remain firmly shut due to air pressure during flight. When Lowenstein failed to return to his seat after an unusually long absence, his concerned secretary went to check on him. The washroom was empty. A search of the entire aircraft revealed the impossible truth. Alfred Lowenstein had somehow vanished from the plane while flying thousands of feet above the churning waters of the Channel. The crew made an emergency landing on a beach near Dunkirk, France, but it took precious time before the pilot finally admitted what had happened. Lowenstein had somehow exited the aircraft during flight, leaving behind one of aviation's most baffling puzzles. How could a passenger simply disappear from a small plane without anyone noticing? Later tests would reveal just how impossible Lowenstein's disappearance seemed. The exterior door was incredibly difficult to open during flight, requiring the combined strength of 2 men to overcome the air pressure that held it shut. The slipstream would have immediately slammed the door closed again if someone had managed to open it. Yet somehow, Lowenstein had gone through that door and plummeted into the sea below. A massive search operation was launched immediately, with boats and aircraft scouring the Channel waters for any sign of the missing financier. For 2 agonizing weeks, nothing was found. Then, on July 19th, French fishermen spotted a body floating in the sea near Boulogne. The corpse was identified as Lowenstein by his distinctive wristwatch still ticking on his wrist. The autopsy revealed that Lowenstein had suffered a fractured skull and multiple broken bones, consistent with hitting the water at high speed from a great height. Crucially, there were no bullet wounds or other signs of violence that might indicate foul play. The medical examiner determined that Lowenstein had been alive when he hit the water, ruling out the possibility that he had been eliminated before being thrown from the plane. But the absence of obvious trauma only deepened the mystery. If Lowenstein hadn't been attacked, how had he ended up falling from his own aircraft? The 3 main theories, accident, self-harm, or elimination by others, each seemed to present insurmountable problems. The accident theory suggested that Lowenstein, perhaps confused or absent-minded, had mistaken the exterior door for the washroom door and simply walked out into thin air. The New York Times even hypothesized that the wealthy businessman was simply preoccupied and made a fatal error. But this explanation seemed almost laughably inadequate, given the physical impossibility of accidentally opening the exterior door. Another accident scenario proposed that Lowenstein had been overcome by fumes from the aircraft's engine and had collapsed against the door, somehow causing it to open just enough for him to fall through. However, extensive tests showed that the door's design made this virtually impossible. The air pressure would have kept it firmly closed, regardless of any weight pressed against it. The self-harm theory was quickly dismissed by those who knew Lowenstein well. Despite facing some financial pressures, he had been making major investments and planning for the future right up until his death. He showed no signs of depression or desperation that might drive someone to take their own life. Moreover, the physical difficulty of opening the door made it extremely unlikely that someone could accomplish such an act alone, particularly if they were intent on ending their life. This left the most disturbing possibility that Alfred Lowenstein had been eliminated by someone else aboard the aircraft. The wealthy financier had accumulated many enemies during his rise to power, including business rivals who might benefit from his death. His personal relationships were equally complicated, particularly with his wife Madeline, who stood to inherit millions and was rumored to be romantically involved with one of his pilots. The elimination theory gained credibility from several suspicious circumstances surrounding the flight. French witnesses reported seeing what appeared to be a parachute falling from the sky around the time Lowenstein vanished, possibly the aircraft's door being jettisoned after the deed was done. The plane had made an unexplained landing on a beach, potentially allowing accomplices to replace the original door with a spare that had been brought along to hide evidence of tampering. Most significantly, Lowenstein's wife, Madeline, displayed a stunning lack of grief over her husband's death. She didn't even attend his funeral, and the grave marker was never engraved with his name, effectively making it an unmarked burial. Her behavior suggested either complete indifference to his fate or guilty knowledge of what had really happened. Investigators theorized that the flight crew and passengers might have been part of an elaborate conspiracy to eliminate Lowenstein for financial gain. According to this scenario, his valet and secretary could have overpowered him near the door and pushed him out while the aircraft was flying over the channel. The mysterious beach landing would then have provided the perfect opportunity to swap doors and eliminate evidence of their crime. However, despite extensive investigations by authorities on both sides of the channel, no concrete proof of foul play was ever found. The surviving crew members maintained their story that Lowenstein had simply vanished without explanation, and no charges were ever filed against anyone aboard the aircraft. A more exotic theory suggested that Lowenstein might have faked his own death to escape mounting financial problems or pending scandals. Some evidence supported this possibility. His business empire was indeed highly leveraged and potentially near collapse when he died. Years later, investigators would discover that his finances were in far worse shape than anyone had realized at the time. The faked death theory proposed that Lowenstein had somehow survived his exit from the aircraft, possibly using a parachute or accomplices positioned in boats below. The body recovered from the channel could have been someone else or Lowenstein himself after dying from other causes. This would explain his wife's strange indifference and the unmarked grave. Perhaps she knew he had initially survived, but died later from other causes. Yet this theory struggled to explain the practical impossibilities involved. How could someone exit an aircraft at 4,000 feet and survive without anyone noticing the necessary preparations? How could a body be switched or planted in the channel waters without detection? The logistical challenges seemed as daunting as those faced by any other explanation. nearly a century after Alfred Lowenstein's mysterious disappearance. The case remains officially unsolved. Aviation experts have never been able to explain how a passenger could vanish from such a small aircraft without leaving obvious evidence of what occurred. The physical impossibility of opening the exterior door during flight continues to baffle investigators and armchair detectives alike. Modern analysis of the case has focused on the technical aspects of 1920s aviation, examining whether the door mechanism could have failed or been tampered with in ways that weren't understood at the time. However, even with contemporary engineering knowledge, no plausible explanation has emerged for how Lowenstein could have exited the aircraft under the circumstances described. The case has become a touchstone for aviation mysteries, often cited alongside other famous disappearances like Amelia Earhart's vanishing over the Pacific. Unlike many such cases, however, Lowenstein's body was actually recovered, providing physical evidence that should have resolved the mystery. Instead, it only deepened the puzzle by confirming that he had indeed fallen from a great height, while showing no signs of violence. For the Lowenstein family, the lack of resolution created lasting trauma and suspicion. The suggestion that Alfred might have taken his own life was devastating to his reputation and legacy, while the possibility of elimination raised terrifying questions about the safety of even the wealthiest and most powerful individuals. The case also highlighted the limitations of 1920s forensic science and investigative techniques. Without modern tools like DNA analysis, detailed ballistics testing, or sophisticated toxicology screens, investigators had to rely primarily on physical evidence and witness testimony. The absence of obvious trauma or signs of struggle left them with few concrete clues to pursue. Today, Alfred Lowenstein's death is remembered as one of history's perfect mysteries, a case where the physical evidence seems clear, but the circumstances remain impossible to explain. Whether he was a victim of an elaborate conspiracy, a tragic accident, or his own desperate final act, the truth died with him in the cold waters of the English Channel, leaving behind only questions that may never be answered. In July 2007, the small farming community of Nannup in Western Australia became the center of one of the country's most baffling disappearances. 4 people connected to an obscure doomsday cult simply vanished without a trace, leaving behind a scene of everyday normalcy that would haunt investigators for years to come. 27-year-old Chantel McDougall had been living on a rural property outside Nannup with her 5-year-old daughter Leela, her partner Tony Popick, and the leader of their religious group, a man calling himself Simon Cadwell. The group followed an internet-based cult known as the Truth Fellowship, which preached that an apocalypse was imminent and that true believers would be rescued by extraterrestrial beings. Cadwell, whose real name was Gary Felton, was a 45-year-old Englishman who had established himself as a spiritual guru through online forums and websites. He taught his followers that the end times were approaching and that only those who had achieved the proper spiritual preparation would survive the coming catastrophe. The Nannup farmhouse served as headquarters for his small but devoted group of believers. On July 13, 2007, the 4 cult members traveled to the nearby town of Bustleton, where they sold Chantel's car to a local dealer. Witnesses saw them being picked up by someone in another vehicle, but that would be the last confirmed sighting of any of them. They had simply vanished, leaving behind a mystery that would confound investigators for years. When concerned family members went to check on them several days later, they found the Nannup farmhouse in an eerie state of suspended animation. Dirty dishes sat on the kitchen table as if the occupants had just stepped away from a meal. Wallets and credit cards remained untouched, along with all the personal belongings one would normally take on any extended journey. Most mysteriously, a handwritten note was stuck to the front door with a simple message: "Gone to Brazil." But when authorities investigated, they could find no record of any of the 4 people leaving Australia through official channels. No flights had been booked under their names, no passport stamps recorded their departure, and no border crossing documentation existed to support their claim of international travel. Inside the house, investigators found evidence that the group had been planning some kind of departure. 2 passports had been obtained for Chantel and Leela just 2 months before their disappearance, and there were records of large cash withdrawals from bank accounts in the days leading up to their vanishing. A single packed suitcase was found in the house, complete with an airline check-in tag, but no corresponding flight records could be located. Phone records revealed that the group had made inquiries about flights and had even booked tickets under an alias for domestic travel within Western Australia around July 16th. However, after that date, all phone activities ceased completely, as if the 4 people had simply ceased to exist. The investigation quickly revealed the disturbing dynamics within the cult group. Simon Cadwell exercised an almost hypnotic control over his followers, particularly Chantel, who had been involved with the group since her late teens. Her parents later described how their daughter had been completely brainwashed by Cadwell's teachings and had gradually cut herself off from her family and former friends. Cadwell himself was revealed to be a deeply troubled individual, with a history of manipulating vulnerable young women. Police discovered that he had previously been investigated for assault charges and had a pattern of targeting emotionally fragile individuals who were seeking spiritual guidance. The cult leader spent most of his time online, communicating with followers around the world while contributing little to the practical aspects of running the commune. The group's beliefs centered around apocalyptic visions and the promise of salvation through extraterrestrial intervention. Cadwell taught that electromagnetic waves were being used by governments to control people's minds, and that material possessions were spiritual obstacles that needed to be abandoned. Members were encouraged to sell their belongings and prepare for a journey to a promised land where they would be safe from the coming destruction. As the investigation progressed, several disturbing theories emerged about what might have happened to the missing family. The most optimistic scenario suggested that they had somehow managed to leave Australia secretly and were living under new identities in a remote location, possibly in South America as their note had suggested. This theory was supported by their apparent preparations for departure and their stated intention to travel to Brazil. However, investigators found several problems with the voluntary disappearance theory. Despite extensive searches in Brazil and cooperation from international law enforcement agencies, no trace of the 4 people was ever found. Their bank accounts remained untouched after July 2007, and no credible sightings were reported despite widespread media coverage of their disappearance. A more sinister possibility was that the group had carried out some form of collective self-harm or had been the victims of foul play. Cadwell's teachings often referenced peaceful departure from the earthly realm, and some investigators wondered whether he had convinced his followers to participate in a group elimination as a form of spiritual transcendence. This theory gained credibility from the known history of similar cult groups that had engaged in mass self-destruction when their predicted apocalypses failed to materialize. The timing of the disappearance, coming after several failed predictions about the end times, suggested that Cadwell might have convinced his followers that their only escape was through death. The investigation also considered the possibility that Cadwell himself had harmed his followers before taking his own life or fleeing. His history of manipulating young women and his obvious psychological instability made him a potential threat to those under his influence. Some investigators theorized that he might have led the group to a remote location where he eliminated them and then disposed of their bodies. A more mundane but equally tragic theory suggested that the group had fallen victim to criminals while attempting to travel overseas illegally. If they had indeed tried to charter a private aircraft or boat to leave Australia without proper documentation, they might have encountered dangerous individuals who robbed and eliminated them for their cash. In 2011, a coroner's inquest was held to examine the evidence and attempt to determine what had happened to the 4 missing people. After hearing from dozens of witnesses and examining all available evidence, the coroner delivered an open finding, stating that he could not determine whether the group was alive or dead. The coroner acknowledged that evidence existed to support multiple theories. The group's preparations and their sudden cessation of all contact suggested they might have died soon after disappearing, either through self-harm or violence by others. However, the lack of bodies and the possibility of unverified sightings in other countries meant that they could potentially still be alive somewhere. The case took on renewed urgency in 2018 when another inquest was held, incorporating new investigative techniques and international database searches. However, even with modern forensic tools and improved international cooperation, no new evidence emerged to resolve the mystery. Throughout the investigation, several unconfirmed sightings were reported from various countries, including claims that the family had been seen in Indonesia, Brazil, and other South American nations. However, none of these reports could be substantiated, and they only added to the confusion surrounding the case. The disappearance highlighted serious questions about how authorities handle cases involving religious groups and vulnerable individuals. Chantel's family criticized what they saw as inadequate early intervention that might have prevented the tragedy. They argued that social services should have been more proactive in protecting Leela from what they viewed as a dangerous cult environment. The case also demonstrated the challenges faced by modern law enforcement when dealing with individuals who deliberately try to disappear. In an age of global travel and digital communication, it's theoretically possible for people to vanish completely if they have sufficient resources and planning. The Nanap Group's apparent preparations suggested they might have been more organized than initially believed. For the families left behind, the lack of resolution has been devastating. Chantel's parents spent years hoping for any news of their daughter and granddaughter, while struggling with the possibility that they might never learn the truth about what happened. The uncertainty has made it impossible for them to grieve properly or find any form of closure. In 2021, 14 years after the disappearance, Chantel's father made a renewed public appeal for information. He described the ongoing anguish of not knowing as an emotional roller coaster and pleaded with anyone who might have knowledge of the case to come forward, no matter how insignificant their information might seem. The Nanap cult disappearance remains one of Australia's most perplexing unsolved cases. Whether the 4 missing people are living secretly in a remote location, were victims of violence, or took their own lives in fulfillment of their spiritual beliefs may never be known. The case serves as a stark reminder of how people can vanish without a trace in the modern world, leaving behind only questions and the broken hearts of those who love them. In April 2003, the small village of Starowa Gora near Łódź, Poland, became the center of one of the country's most baffling mysteries, when an entire family simply vanished without leaving any trace of where they had gone or why they had left. The disappearance of the Bogdański family would puzzle investigators for decades and spawn theories ranging from voluntary escape to organized crime retaliation. The family consisted of 42-year-old Krzysztof Bogdański, his 44-year-old wife Bożena, their teenage children, 15-year-old Małgorzata and 11-year-old Jakub, and Krzysztof's 66-year-old mother Danuta. They had moved from the city of Łódź to their rural home in the late 1990s, seeking a quieter life away from urban pressures. Krzysztof was an electronics specialist who ran a small business importing electrical equipment, though by 2003, his company was struggling financially due to increased competition from cheaper Chinese imports. Despite mounting debts to banks and private lenders, the family maintained a relatively comfortable lifestyle and seemed to be managing their difficulties. The family was last seen around Easter of 2003, with different witnesses placing the final sightings anywhere between April 10th and April 18th. When concerned relatives were unable to reach them by telephone for several weeks, they contacted authorities and requested a welfare check at the family home. On May 8, 2003, police entered the Bogdański residence and found a scene that would become legendary in Polish criminal folklore. The house appeared completely normal, as if the family had simply stepped out for a brief errand and would return at any moment. A load of laundry sat in the washing machine. Dishes from a recent meal were clean and drying in the rack, and the children's school books and medications remained on shelves where they belonged. Most puzzling of all, the family's passports, identification documents, and wallets were all found inside the house, suggesting they hadn't planned any official travel. There were even partially packed suitcases sitting near the door, as if someone had begun preparing for a trip but hadn't finished. About 4,000 euros worth of money remained untouched in their bank account, an unusual detail if they had planned a long journey requiring significant funds. The doors to the house were locked, and there were no signs of forced entry or struggle anywhere on the property. Nothing appeared to have been stolen or disturbed, and no evidence of violence could be found. It was as though the 5 family members had simply evaporated into thin air, leaving behind all their earthly possessions in perfect order. The family's car was also missing, which initially led investigators to believe they might have driven away voluntarily. However, despite extensive searches and international alerts through Interpol, no record of the vehicle crossing any borders was ever found. The car seemed to have vanished as completely as the family itself. Polish authorities launched an intensive investigation that included searches of surrounding forests, ponds, and rural areas where bodies might have been hidden. Aircraft and ground teams combed through miles of countryside looking for any trace of the missing family or their vehicle. Despite these extensive efforts, not a single clue was discovered. As the investigation progressed, disturbing details emerged about Krzysztof's business dealings and financial situation. He had accumulated significant debts not only to legitimate banks, but also to private individuals who may not have been entirely respectable. Some of these creditors were rumored to have connections to organized crime figures who were known for their violent methods of debt collection. Investigators discovered that in the months leading up to their disappearance, the Bogdańskis had been selling off personal possessions and paying down various debts. They had also canceled utility services and made other arrangements that suggested they were planning a permanent departure from their home. However, these preparations seemed incomplete, as if their plans had been interrupted or accelerated unexpectedly. One particularly unsettling detail emerged during the investigation. After the family vanished, Neighbors reported seeing lights turning on and off in the Bogdański house at night, along with the sound of the family dog barking inside. By the time police arrived to investigate, the dog had also disappeared, adding another layer of mystery to an already baffling case. The discovery that Krzysztof's personal computer and some business documents were missing from his home office suggested that either he had taken them with him or someone else had removed them after the family's departure. This evidence pointed toward a planned disappearance rather than a sudden emergency or act of violence. Several theories emerged to explain what might have happened to the Bogdański family. The most optimistic scenario suggested they had voluntarily left Poland to escape mounting financial pressures and start new lives elsewhere, possibly using false identities to avoid detection. This theory was supported by their apparent preparations and the absence of any obvious signs of violence. However, skeptics of the voluntary disappearance theory pointed to several problems with this explanation. If the family had planned to flee permanently, why would they leave money in their bank account and pack only partially? Why would they abandon their beloved family dog? Most importantly, why would the children, now adults if still alive, never contact friends or relatives in Poland after so many years of separation? A much darker theory suggested that the family had been eliminated by creditors or criminal figures who were owed money. According to this scenario, they might have been lured to a meeting under false pretenses and then eliminated, with their bodies disposed of in a way that would ensure they were never found. The missing car could have been destroyed or hidden as part of covering up the crime. This theory gained credibility when investigators learned that after the family's disappearance, suspicious individuals had been seen around their property, possibly searching for valuables or evidence. Some of these visitors might have been creditors looking for assets to seize, while others could have been accomplices returning to clean up evidence of their involvement in the family's fate. A particularly disturbing variation of the foul play theory suggested that Krzysztof himself might have been responsible for his family's deaths. Under extreme financial and psychological pressure, some family annihilators choose to eliminate their loved ones rather than face the shame of financial ruin. This scenario would require Krzysztof to dispose of 4 bodies and a car before taking his own life or disappearing. But it wasn't impossible in rural areas with vast forests and abandoned properties. Polish investigators also considered more exotic possibilities, including connections to human trafficking networks or even witness protection programs. However, no evidence ever emerged to support these theories, and they remained purely speculative. The case attracted extensive media coverage throughout Poland and was featured on numerous television programs and documentary series. The phrase "vanished into thin air" became permanently associated with the Bogdański family, and their story entered Polish folklore as one of the country's most enduring mysteries. In 2011, the case was officially reclassified as a likely homicide based on the accumulated evidence and the passage of time without any contact from the family members. However, without bodies or a crime scene, prosecutors were unable to pursue charges against anyone, and the investigation remained active but dormant. Periodic reviews of the case using modern investigative techniques have failed to generate new leads or evidence. DNA databases, international cooperation protocols, and advanced forensic methods have all been applied to the mystery without success. The Bogdański family seems to have achieved a disappearance so complete that it borders on the impossible. In 2024, more than 20 years after the family vanished, Polish authorities confirmed that the case remains officially open and active. While the likelihood of finding any of the family members alive has diminished significantly, investigators continue to hope that new evidence might someday emerge to explain what happened in that rural farmhouse so many years ago. For the people of Starowa Gora and the broader Polish community, the Bogdański mystery serves as a haunting reminder that entire families can vanish without explanation, leaving behind only empty houses and unanswered questions. The case has become a symbol of how quickly the familiar can become frighteningly unknown, and how some secrets may be buried so deeply that they never surface again. Hey everyone, it's here with a quick reminder to like and subscribe if you appreciate this content. Also, remember to check out my other channels for more unsolved mysteries and true crime stories. In the early morning hours of May 30th, 1954, the streets below Rome's prestigious Hotel Eden were shattered by the impact of a falling body. Prince Raimondo Lanza di Trabia, a 39-year-old Italian aristocrat known throughout Europe for his wealth, charm, and scandalous lifestyle, had plummeted from his third-floor suite window onto the sidewalk below. What made this tragic incident immediately suspicious was not just the circumstances of the fall, but the shocking state in which the prince was found. Raimondo lay broken on the pavement, completely without clothing, his naked body bearing the catastrophic injuries of a high-speed impact with the unforgiving concrete below. Prince Raimondo had been one of Italy's most colorful and controversial figures, a man whose life read like something from a Hollywood screenplay. Born into one of Sicily's oldest and most prestigious noble families, he had lived with a reckless abandon that both fascinated and scandalized Italian society. His exploits included tiger hunts with foreign royalty, romantic affairs with famous actresses including rumored liaisons with Rita Hayworth, and a lifestyle of gambling and excess that epitomized the glamorous but dangerous world of post-war European nobility. By 1954, Raimondo's seemingly charmed life was showing signs of strain. His gambling habits had accumulated substantial debts to dangerous individuals, and his personal relationships had become increasingly complicated. Just the previous year, he had married Italian actress Olga Villi, and they had 2 young daughters together. However, those close to the couple reported that the marriage was troubled and that Raimondo's reckless behavior was putting enormous stress on his family. The circumstances of his death immediately raised more questions than they answered. Witnesses on the street below, a taxi driver, and a milkman making early morning deliveries, reported seeing a man plummet from the hotel and strike the pavement with a sickening impact. Raimondo was rushed to a nearby hospital with severe head trauma and multiple fractures, but he succumbed to his injuries within a few hours. When police examined his hotel suite, they found a scene that suggested recent activity, but provided few clear answers. Clothes were scattered around the room, an unfinished bottle of champagne sat on a table, and the window from which he had fallen remained open. The door to the suite had been locked from the inside, and there were no obvious signs of a struggle or forced entry. The complete absence of clothing on Raimondo's body immediately fueled speculation about what had transpired in his final moments. Italian newspapers seized upon this salacious detail, with one provocatively asking whether the prince had fallen from grace as dramatically as he had fallen from his window. The naked state suggested he might have been in the midst of an intimate encounter, possibly with a lover who had then vanished without being detected. Medical examination revealed that Raimondo's injuries were consistent with a fall from a great height, showing the expected pattern of skull fractures and broken bones that would result from such an impact. Crucially, there were no bullet wounds, stab marks, or other signs of violence, that might indicate he had been attacked before falling. The absence of defensive wounds suggested he had not fought with an assailant immediately prior to his death. However, the lack of obvious trauma only deepened the mystery surrounding his final moments. If Raimundo had not been physically attacked, how had he ended up falling from his hotel window in such a state? The three most likely explanations, accident, deliberate self-harm, or elimination by others, each presented significant problems when examined closely. The accident theory suggested that Raimundo, heavily intoxicated from an evening of drinking, had become disoriented and somehow stumbled through his window while naked. Perhaps he had been sleeping without clothing and had awakened confused, moving toward the window for fresh air and losing his balance in his impaired state. The hotel's older windows had relatively low sills, making it physically possible for someone to fall through them accidentally. This explanation was supported by reports that Raimundo had been extremely drunk on the night of his death, consuming substantial amounts of alcohol during what appeared to have been a solitary evening in his room. Those familiar with his heavy drinking habits found it plausible that he might have been so intoxicated that he became fatally careless around the open window. However, the deliberate self-harm theory was immediately dismissed by those who knew Raimundo well. Despite his financial troubles and personal difficulties, he had shown no signs of despair or hopelessness that might drive someone to take their own life. In fact, he had been making plans for the future and had recently made several business investments, suggesting he intended to continue living and working through his problems. The most disturbing possibility was that Prince Raimundo had been the victim of foul play, possibly elimination disguised as suicide or accident. His lifestyle had certainly created numerous enemies who might benefit from his death. Business rivals resented his financial success. Creditors were growing increasingly aggressive about collecting his gambling debts, and his personal relationships were fraught with jealousy and betrayal. Most suspiciously, Raimundo's wife Olga displayed an almost shocking lack of grief following her husband's death. She failed to attend his funeral, a breach of social protocol so severe that it scandalized even Italy's blasé upper classes. The grave marker was never engraved with Raimundo's name, effectively creating an unmarked burial that suggested either complete indifference to his memory or guilty knowledge about the circumstances of his death. Investigators discovered that Olga stood to inherit millions from her husband's estate, providing a clear financial motive for wanting him dead. Even more damaging to her reputation were persistent rumors that she was romantically involved with one of Raimundo's business associates, possibly even one of his pilots. If true, this relationship would have given her both motive and opportunity to arrange her husband's elimination. The elimination theory proposed that Raimundo had been entertaining someone in his hotel suite, possibly his wife, her lover, or associates of his creditors. During this meeting, he had been overpowered, possibly drugged or knocked unconscious, and then thrown from his window to make his death appear accidental or self-inflicted. The naked state could have been part of staging the scene to suggest he had been alone and possibly suicidal. Another variation suggested that Raimundo had been the target of organized crime figures who specialized in eliminating people in ways that appeared accidental. The technique of defenestration, NCA, throwing someone from a window, was known to be used by criminal organizations as both an execution method and a warning to others. The absence of obvious violence would be consistent with professional criminals who knew how to stage deaths effectively. However, despite extensive investigation by Italian authorities, no concrete evidence of foul play was ever discovered. The locked hotel room, the absence of witnesses, and the lack of physical evidence of a struggle all worked against the theory that Raimondo had been attacked. Without clear proof of criminal involvement, the case remained frustratingly inconclusive. The Italian press had a field day with the scandal, turning Raimondo's death into a symbol of the decadence and moral decay they saw in the post-war aristocracy. The combination of wealth, sex, violence, and mystery proved irresistible to newspapers and magazines, who covered every salacious detail with breathless excitement. Public reaction was mixed, with some viewing Raimondo as a tragic figure whose excess had finally caught up with him, while others suspected that darker forces had been responsible for his death. The lack of a clear resolution allowed conspiracy theories to flourish, with various groups speculating about everything from mafia hits to political assassinations. The case attracted the attention of Italian singer Domenico Modugno, who dedicated his 1955 song Vecchio Frac, Old Tuxedo, to the mysterious death of a well-dressed gentleman widely believed to be Raimondo. The song spoke of a dapper man who leaped to his death, leaving the world guessing about his motives, a fitting tribute to a mystery that had captured the public imagination. Italian authorities ultimately classified Prince Raimondo's death as suspicious, with no conclusive evidence of foul play, essentially an open verdict that satisfied no one. No arrests were made, no charges filed, and no definitive explanation provided for how a wealthy, powerful man had ended up falling naked from a hotel window. The lack of resolution created lasting trauma for those who had known and cared about Raimondo. His family was forced to live with persistent whispers about suicide, while his friends remained convinced that he had been the victim of a sophisticated plot. The uncertainty poisoned relationships and created divisions that lasted for years. The case also highlighted the limitations of 1950s forensic science and investigative techniques. Without modern tools like DNA analysis, detailed toxicology testing, or advanced crime scene reconstruction, investigators had to rely primarily on witness testimony and basic physical evidence. The absence of obvious clues left them with little concrete information to pursue. Today, more than 70 years after Prince Raimondo's mysterious death, the case remains one of Italy's most famous unsolved mysteries. True crime enthusiasts continue to debate the various theories, while historians use it as an example of the dark underbelly of Italy's post-war economic miracle. Whether Raimondo Lanza di Trabbia was the victim of his own reckless excess, a carefully planned elimination, or simply a tragic accident may never be known. His death serves as a reminder that even wealth and privilege cannot protect someone from the consequences of a dangerous lifestyle, and that some secrets die with those who take them to unmarked graves. On June 8, 1989, 2 weeks after she had been reported missing, the body of 44-year-old nurse Cindy James was discovered in the yard of an abandoned house in Richmond, British Columbia. The scene that greeted investigators would spark one of Canada's most controversial unsolved cases and raise disturbing questions about the nature of victimhood, mental illness, and the limits of police investigation. Cindy's body was found in a horrific state, hog-tied with her hands and feet, bound tightly behind her back using multiple nylon stockings. A black pantyhose was knotted around her neck as a ligature, and she was naked from the waist down. The position was so restrictive that officers at the scene remarked it would have been nearly impossible for her to have restrained herself in such a manner. But the discovery of Cindy James's body was only the final chapter in a 7-year saga of terror that had baffled police and divided public opinion. Since 1982, Cindy had reported nearly 100 incidents of harassment, stalking, and physical attacks by an unknown assailant who seemed determined to torment her. The pattern of incidents had been both persistent and escalating. Cindy regularly reported threatening phone calls, prowlers outside her house, cut phone lines, and strange notes left on her doorstep. More seriously, she had been found on several occasions semi-conscious with ligatures around her neck and her hands and feet bound, claiming she had been abducted and attacked by a mysterious stalker. Each incident followed a similar pattern. Cindy would be found in distress, usually with nylon stockings tied around her neck and limbs, claiming that an unknown man had overpowered her, drugged her, and subjected her to various forms of abuse before leaving her to be discovered. However, despite extensive investigation, police were never able to identify any suspects or find concrete evidence of the alleged stalker's existence. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police had grown increasingly skeptical of Cindy's reports as the incidents continued, without any corroborating evidence. No neighbors ever witnessed the attacks, no physical evidence of an intruder was found, and surveillance efforts failed to detect any suspicious activity around Cindy's home. The lack of independent verification led some investigators to theorize that Cindy might be staging the incidents herself due to psychological problems. Cindy James was a divorced woman with no children who worked as a psychiatric nurse at a local hospital. She had been struggling with depression and anxiety for several years and had been hospitalized for mental health treatment on multiple occasions. Her personal history included a difficult divorce and ongoing stress related to her demanding job working with mentally ill patients. The final incident began on May 25, 1989, when Cindy's car was found abandoned in a parking lot, with blood on the driver's side door and her personal belongings scattered around the vehicle. The scene suggested a struggle had taken place, but no witnesses had seen what happened, and no evidence of an abduction was found beyond the disarray in her car. For 2 weeks, an extensive search was conducted throughout the Vancouver area, involving both police officers and civilian volunteers. Despite these efforts, no trace of Cindy was found until her body was discovered in that abandoned yard, raising immediate questions about how she had ended up there and what had happened during her final days. The autopsy results created even more controversy and confusion. Cindy had died from an overdose of morphine and other sedatives, approximately 10 times the normal lethal dose of the powerful opioid, plus traces of diazepam and other drugs. The massive amount of narcotics in her system indicated she had been heavily drugged, but the medical examiner could not determine whether the drugs had been self-administered or forced upon her. The presence of needle marks on her arm was particularly puzzling, since Cindy was known to have a severe phobia of needles and was not an intravenous drug user. The idea that she would willingly inject herself with such a large dose of morphine seemed inconsistent with both her medical knowledge and her documented fears. Most controversially, investigators found no clear evidence of a violent struggle at the location where her body was discovered. There were no obvious signs that she had been dragged to the site or that a fight had occurred there. This lack of disturbance led some police officials to theorize that Cindy might have staged her own final attack and accidentally overdosed herself while trying to make it appear that she had been eliminated by her stalker. The police theory suggested that Cindy had been suffering from a severe form of attention-seeking behavior, possibly Munchausen syndrome, and that all of the previous incidents had been self-inflicted attempts to gain sympathy and support. According to this interpretation, her final act had been intended as the ultimate proof of her stalker's existence, but had gone tragically wrong when she miscalculated the drug dosage. However, Cindy's family and friends vehemently rejected the suicide theory, pointing to the physical impossibility of her binding herself in the manner found. The hogtie position required someone to secure the victim's wrists behind their back and then connect them to their ankles with additional restraints. Even flexible individuals would find it extremely difficult to accomplish this alone, particularly after injecting a massive dose of sedatives. Crime scene photographs showed knots that appeared to require a second person to complete, especially given how tightly they had been tied. The restriction was so severe that circulation would have been cut off within minutes, making it unlikely that someone could remain conscious long enough to finish the binding after taking such a large dose of drugs. The family also emphasized Cindy's genuine terror during the years of reported attacks. They had witnessed her fear firsthand and had seen evidence of some of the incidents, including harassing phone calls that occurred while they were present. While they acknowledged that Cindy had been struggling with mental health issues, they insisted that her fear of her stalker was completely real and that she would never have harmed herself in such a manner. A coroner's inquest was held in 1990 to examine all the evidence and attempt to determine what had really happened to Cindy James. After hearing testimony from more than 80 witnesses, including police officers, medical experts, family members, and friends, the jury reached an unusual conclusion. Rather than ruling the death a suicide, accident, or homicide, the jury delivered an open verdict declaring that Cindy had died from an unknown event. This finding essentially acknowledged that while the evidence pointed toward some form of foul play, the circumstances were too unclear to make a definitive determination about whether she had taken her own life or been eliminated by another person. The open verdict reflected the jury's belief that something didn't add up about the official police theory. If Cindy had been capable of binding herself so elaborately while under the influence of massive amounts of drugs, why were there no practice attempts or evidence of how she had developed such skills? The precision and effectiveness of the restraints seemed inconsistent with someone acting alone while severely impaired. Several theories emerged to explain what might have actually happened to Cindy James during her final days. The most sinister possibility was that she had indeed been the victim of a cunning stalker who had tormented her for years before finally carrying out his ultimate plan. This theory suggested that her previous reports had been genuine, but that police skepticism had allowed the perpetrator to continue his campaign of terror undetected. According to this scenario, the stalker could have been someone Cindy knew, possibly her ex-husband, a former colleague from the hospital, or another individual with access to her daily routine. This person could have been intelligent enough to avoid leaving obvious evidence while conducting a sophisticated psychological warfare campaign against her. The final act could have involved abducting Cindy, holding her captive while administering the fatal drug dose, and then staging her body to make the death appear self-inflicted. The killer's familiarity with her previous incidents would have enabled them to create a scene that fit the pattern, while providing enough ambiguity to avoid obvious murder charges. Another theory suggested that while some of Cindy's earlier reports might have been self-inflicted due to psychological distress, her final incident had been real. Perhaps someone had learned about her pattern of staged attacks and decided to take advantage of the situation to eliminate her, while making it appear to be another self-inflicted incident. This would explain why the final scene was more elaborate and deadly than her previous experiences. The investigation also considered the possibility that Cindy's death had been connected to her work at the psychiatric hospital. As a nurse, dealing with potentially dangerous patients, she could have encountered someone who developed an obsession with her or harbored resentment over her treatment decisions. Mental health facilities often deal with individuals who might be capable of elaborate revenge schemes or fixation behaviors. However, despite extensive investigation and multiple reviews of the evidence, no suspects were ever identified or charged in connection with Cindy James's death. The case officially remains unsolved, with different law enforcement agencies holding different opinions about what actually occurred. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police continue to maintain that Cindy's death was most likely a suicide or accidental overdose, connected to her long-standing pattern of self-inflicted incidents. They point to the absence of credible evidence for an external stalker and the psychological profile suggesting attention-seeking behavior as support for their theory. However, many members of the public, along with victim advocacy groups, continue to believe that Cindy was the victim of a sophisticated predator who successfully evaded detection for 7 years. They argue that the dismissive attitude toward her reports may have enabled her eventual elimination and that gender bias in law enforcement contributed to the failure to protect her. The case has become a symbol in Canada of how difficult it can be to distinguish between genuine victimization and psychological distress, particularly when the alleged victim is a woman reporting crimes that leave little physical evidence. It highlights the challenges faced by both law enforcement and mental health professionals when dealing with cases that blur the line between reality and delusion. Cindy James's death also raises broader questions about the responsibility of police to protect individuals who report ongoing harassment, even when the claims seem dubious or inconsistent. The failure to prevent her death, regardless of its ultimate cause, represents a systematic breakdown that continues to generate controversy and debate. More than 30 years after Cindy James was found dead in that Richmond backyard, her case remains one of Canada's most polarizing unsolved mysteries. Whether she was a victim of her own psychological demons or of a predator clever enough to hide in plain sight may never be definitively determined, leaving her story as a haunting reminder of how complex and tragic the intersection of mental illness and criminal investigation can become. On July 6, 1992, the body of 46-year-old Marcia P. Johnson was discovered floating in the Hudson River near the Christopher Street Piers in New York City. The death of this beloved transgender activist and drag performer would expose deep flaws in how the justice system treats marginalized communities and raise questions that continue to resonate more than 3 decades later. Marcia had been a fixture in New York's Greenwich Village for over 2 decades, known for her vibrant personality, her advocacy for LGBTQ+ youth, and her pivotal role in the Stonewall Uprising of 1969. As a co-founder of STAR, House Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, she had dedicated her life to helping vulnerable young people who had been rejected by their families and society. The circumstances surrounding Marcia's death immediately raised concerns among her friends and the broader LGBTQ+ community. Just 2 days earlier, she had been participating in New York City's Pride March festivities, appearing to be in good spirits and looking forward to upcoming performances and community events. Those who knew her well insisted that she was not exhibiting signs of despair that might lead to self-harm. However, the New York Police Department's response to Marcia's death was cursory at best. Officers quickly concluded that she had likely taken her own life by jumping or falling into the river, possibly during a period of mental health crisis. The medical examiner listed the cause of death as asphyxia by drowning and initially classified the manner as suicide without conducting a thorough investigation. This hasty determination infuriated Marsha's friends and fellow activists, who immediately challenged the official conclusion. They pointed to several factors that cast doubt on the suicide ruling, beginning with Marsha's mental state and future plans. Despite struggling with schizophrenia, she had been receiving treatment and was generally optimistic about her life and work. More troubling were reports of harassment and threats that Marsha had experienced in the days leading up to her death. On the night of July 4th, witnesses claimed they had seen her being chased or harassed by a group of young men using homophobic and transphobic slurs near the Christopher Street piers. This area was known to be frequented by individuals who specifically targeted LGBTQ+ people for violence and intimidation. The early 1990s were a particularly dangerous time for transgender individuals, especially transgender women of color like Marsha. Anti-LGBTQ+ violence was common, and perpetrators rarely faced serious consequences for their actions. The piers area, while serving as an important gathering place for the community, was also known to attract predators who saw vulnerable individuals as easy targets. Friends who viewed Marsha's body at the morgue reported seeing what appeared to be a significant head injury, possibly a hole in her skull, that suggested she might have been struck with a blunt object before ending up in the water. Police dismissed these observations, claiming that any injuries were either post-mortem damage or the result of her body striking submerged objects in the river. The condition of Marsha's clothing also raised questions. Her dress was reportedly torn and not properly positioned on her body, which supporters argued was evidence of a struggle. However, investigators countered that clothing can become disheveled when a body spends time in moving water, making it difficult to draw definitive conclusions from such evidence. Perhaps most damaging to the police investigation was the clear evidence of bias and indifference in how the case was handled. The LGBTQ+ community strongly believed that if Marsha had been a cisgender, heterosexual person, her death would have received much more thorough investigation. Instead, she was dismissed as just another troubled individual from a marginalized community whose death wasn't worth extensive police resources. The lack of serious investigation was seen as part of a broader pattern of discrimination against transgender people, particularly transgender women of color, whose lives were often undervalued by law enforcement and the justice system. This systemic bias meant that crimes against such individuals were frequently ignored or inadequately investigated, creating a climate of impunity for perpetrators. Within weeks of Marsha's death, her friend and fellow activist Sylvia Rivera organized protests and rallies demanding justice. They formed coalitions to pressure the police department to reopen the investigation and treat Marsha's death as the potential homicide they believed it to be. Their chants of Marsha P. Johnson didn't commit suicide, she was eliminated, echoed through Greenwich Village as they demanded accountability. Despite these efforts, the case remained closed for years, with police showing little interest in pursuing alternative theories or conducting additional investigation. The official stance remained that Marsha had taken her own life, possibly during a mental health crisis, and that there was no evidence to support treating her death as a criminal matter. The situation began to change slowly due to persistent advocacy and growing awareness of transgender issues. In 2002, 20 years after her death, The NYPD finally reclassified Marsha's case from suicide to undetermined, acknowledging that the original investigation had been inadequate and that questions remained about what had actually happened. This reclassification was followed in 2012 by the assignment of a detective to officially reinvestigate Marsha's death as a possible homicide. The renewed investigation was prompted partly by media attention, including a documentary project that uncovered new witness statements and raised additional questions about the original conclusions. One particularly intriguing lead involved a woman who claimed that a neighborhood resident had confessed to her that he had pushed Marsha during an argument, causing her to fall into the river. However, this information was hearsay, and the alleged confessor had died by the time investigators attempted to pursue the lead, making it impossible to verify or develop further. The reopened investigation also attempted to use modern forensic techniques on whatever evidence remained from the original case. However, the passage of time and the limited evidence collection from 1992 made it difficult to apply contemporary scientific methods effectively. Without additional physical evidence or credible witness testimony, investigators found it challenging to build a case for any particular theory. As of 2021, Marsha P. Johnson's death remains officially classified as unsolved by the New York Police Department. While the case is technically open, no arrests have been made, and no suspects have been publicly identified. The investigation appears to have reached another impasse, leaving Marsha's friends and supporters frustrated by the continued lack of resolution. The impact of Marsha's death has extended far beyond the immediate question of what happened on that July night in 1992. Her case has become a rallying point for transgender rights activists and a symbol of the violence faced by transgender women of color. The initial mishandling of her death investigation has been cited as an example of how systemic discrimination can deny justice to marginalized communities. In the years following her death, numerous tributes have been paid to Marsha's memory and legacy. Documentaries, books, and articles have examined both her life's work and the circumstances of her death, helping to keep public attention focused on the unresolved questions surrounding her case. In 2020, New York City announced plans to erect a monument honoring both Marsha and Sylvia Rivera for their contributions to LGBTQ+ rights. The case has also been used to educate new generations about the ongoing violence faced by transgender individuals, particularly transgender women of color. Statistics continue to show that this population faces disproportionately high rates of violence and discrimination, with many cases receiving inadequate attention from law enforcement. Marsha's story serves as a reminder that behind every unsolved case is a real person whose life had value and meaning to those who knew them. Her contributions to the LGBTQ+ rights movement were significant and lasting, helping to create safer spaces and support systems for vulnerable young people. The failure to provide her with justice in death represents not just a personal tragedy for those who loved her, but a broader failure of social institutions to protect all members of society equally. The continued uncertainty surrounding Marsha P. Johnson's death reflects the complex challenges faced by investigators, activists, and families when dealing with cases that intersect with discrimination, mental illness, and social marginalization. While modern attitudes toward LGBTQ+ issues have evolved significantly since 1992, the fundamental questions raised by her case remain relevant to contemporary discussions about justice, equality, and the responsibility of society to protect its most vulnerable members. Whether Marsha P. Johnson was the victim of anti-transgender violence or died under other circumstances, may never be definitively determined. However, her life's work and the ongoing efforts to seek justice for her death continue to inspire activists and advocates who refuse to let her story be forgotten or dismissed. In that sense, her voice continues to demand justice, even decades after it was tragically silenced. Hey everyone! Thanks for watching this compilation of some of history's most puzzling and controversial death cases.